Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Dwayne Schultes from Vital Transformation. I'm going to be helping with the production of this event this afternoon. Thank you very much for your participation. Just a couple things before we get started. We've had several hundred of you register, so we just want to make sure that everyone can participate. If you're having trouble with your bandwidth, with your computer connection, and you would like to phone in, next to the mute button on your control panel, you can switch to the phone audio. We've provided several dozen phone numbers for you toll free, so you can dial in. And if you're having connectivity issues, please feel free to do so we can make sure that we've got your participation in the webinar. As well, we do want questions, and we will be taking questions from the audience. So there's a little question bar on the menu. And as we proceed through the webinar, please feel free to submit your questions, and we'll be filtering them through the audience and as well as through the other members of the panel. And you can even vote on questions that you think are more important than others. So the ones that group thinks is more pertinent or more important can rise to the top, and we'll be able to filter those through to our chair and our speakers. So with that, I now turn over to Bert Leufkens for the introduction. Good afternoon, Bert. Thank you.
Thank you, Dwayne, and thank you, colleagues, for joining this important event. My name is Bert Leufkens. I'm the chairman of the Regulatory Science Network in the Netherlands. I'm very pleased that so many of you joined this afternoon for an interesting, and I hope interesting, event where regulatory science experts from the Netherlands meet with colleagues from the European Medicines Agency, but also to advance the thinking about how to improve regulatory innovation. And I'm very pleased that we had over the last couple of months a very useful and also a very exciting interaction and conversation with colleagues in the field to put this program together. As you can see here on the slide, we have colleagues from the Netherlands, we have colleagues from academia, from industry, from patient involvement, and also, of course, with at the back the regulatory science agenda of the Ehmann. And I think this program is also at the heart of a lot of thinking around how to improve the regulatory system. As we speak today, we see that also in the COVID context, but we have many other challenges ahead on how to improve the balance between scientific requirements, but at the same moment also to enable patient access to relevant therapies. And by saying that, I think it's important that we have this conversation with different stakeholders, because the stakeholder involvement is the key also of the Regulatory Science Network. We strongly believe that no single party has all the truth, and that we have to have this conversation, this alignment, but also this dialogue where we challenge each other on certain positions, but also at the end of the day where we feel that, by moving in the right direction also to bring advanced therapies, but also other therapies to patients and to public health. So I'm looking forward to this program. Sabine Strauss, well known, I think, in the field from the MIB, but also the chairman of the Prague, will chair this afternoon. And Sabine, we are very pleased that you accepted our invitation. And by saying this, I'm very pleased to give you the floor. And the whole meeting is now in your hands, and we're looking forward to an exciting event. Thank you, and Sabine, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Bert, and thank you. I hope I will survive with all the digital issues, and that because when it's in my hands, it's a rather large responsibility. I think we have a very interesting and exciting program, very full and rich. So I would like not to waste too much time. Bert, you already introduced the necessity and the usefulness of this in a very nice way. So thank you very much for that. And that opens up for me the opportunity to hand over to the first speaker of today. And that's with great pleasure that I hand over to Tony Humphreys to take us through the regulatory science agenda of the European Medicines Agency. So please, over to you, Tony.
Yeah, thanks very much, Sabine, and indeed to Professor Leufkens as well. It's a great honor to kick off this session, and our first interaction actually since we moved home from London to Amsterdam with the Regulatory Science Network in the Netherlands itself. and you've invited me to talk on what is probably my favorite topic for the last couple of years, which is our ambitions in the regulatory science agenda area, and very much leveraging the value of this collaboration from regulatory science to regulatory innovation. So I'll endeavor to do that now with the help of Dwayne, who's going to advance the slides for me very kindly. So please, if we can have the next one, please. In terms of the role of regulatory science, not just at our agency, but pretty much at any regulators worldwide, we'd all like to think that regulatory science underpins the various guidances and scientific advices we give to developers of medicines, and then translates then into the product assessment, both initial and with the post-authorization life cycle. And this is very much a sort of virtuous image of how we'd like regulatory science to be seen. The reality is when it comes to the resources that's available to actually put into these various areas, it's like an inverted pyramid. I mean, an awful lot of the resources go into the product assessment directly, another significant amount of resources into the guidelines and the various scientific advices that we generate. And then the residual is almost left then to advance the regulatory science itself. And this actually underpins one of the key needs that the regulators have, is to leverage the advantages of collaborating with other stakeholders, and in particular academia, industry, patients, healthcare professionals, to try to advance this regulatory science challenge in tandem. It's certainly not something that we as regulators can do in isolation on our own, certainly not with the resources made available. Next slide, please. In terms of what we came up with, we had this reflection over the last couple of years about how are we going to take forward our agenda in this regulatory science. And we came up with 5 goals for human medicines regulation. And I will go into these in a little bit more detail as we go forward. So next slide again, please. Yeah. I wanted to share with you the perspective of 2 communities. I could do them all, but with the 20-minute time limit, the chair will kill me if I spend too much time on all of the different perspectives. But I wanted to share with you the perspective of the research community and also then the industry as well. And certainly from researchers, what they made of our research agenda was that to facilitate greater collaboration and communication with stakeholders, to improve evidence generation, to close the gap from approval to access, and to encourage data sharing across the EU network. That was considered very, very important. It was also important that we would collectively make funding bodies aware of what are the major goals in regulatory science and what sort of questions needs answering and how to align funding priorities as we go forward. In addition, it was important to align internationally to improve the efficiency of development, as well as bolster efforts in areas such as the 3 Rs and novel applications of things like nanomedicines and borderlines. This contrasts, if we go on to the next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yeah, if we go from the industry, again, the importance, they have a different perspective on the regulatory science challenges. One is that can we have efforts to reduce the complexity of the EU system and reach global alignment to advance this patient-centered access. That was one of the main asks from the industry. And in particular, any sort of emerging frameworks, and I know Sabine, for example, and the colleagues in the PRAC, in this whole real-world evidence, real-world data discussion, and we'll hear more about that in the days to come, as well as aligning of things like clinical trial type innovations, as well as increased regulatory science knowledge exchange enabled by these various cloud-based type systems. So in a sense, you know, a singular strategy, but trying to meet the needs of different stakeholders' perspectives. And I just wanted to give you a flavor of what that the research academia type perspective was vis-a-vis the industry. And I'll develop that a little bit more. If we go on to the next slide, please. Goal 1, and here what we've highlighted is a series of recommendations under this. The basic goal was to catalyze the integration of science and technology in medicines developments, and there was about 7 core recommendations, and it's not surprising that these featured very highly in the priorities both of the research academic community but also the industry development community. And we'll hear more about the challenges of supporting developments in precision medicines, biomarkers, and omics, the translation of advanced therapy products into patient treatments, as well as promoting and investing in things like the Priority Medicine Scheme for Europe, facilitating implementation of novel manufacturing technologies, and creating integrated pathways for getting development advice, both on convergent device medicinal product development, as well as, you know, regulatory advice right across the whole development continuum. So in blue are those areas that were considered very important to the research community, and in brown then those for the industry, the ones that would be considered to make the major change, how we would evolve or improve the ecosystem in Europe. Next slide again, please. When it comes to the second goal about driving collaborative evidence generation, you won't be surprised to see the emphasis there on fostering innovation in clinical trials and developing the regulatory framework for emerging clinical data generation. And if you think about all the device-enabled clinical trial type designs, that's what that sort of ambition is about. Again, that's quite important both for the research academic community as well as the industry community. There was also great interest expressed in optimizing capabilities in modeling, simulation, and extrapolation, knowing that it's not possible to test all products in all patient groups. The idea of doing intelligent extrapolation and filling in the gaps or bridging the gaps is considered a very interesting area to develop and maximize in the years coming forward, as well as exploiting digital technology and artificial intelligence in the decision-making paradigm that we have in the regulatory system. Next slide again, please. On the advancing patient-centered access, it was this whole business about, you know, the regulatory decision is not the end of the story. We all know that HTAs have got to be aware of what's coming down the pipeline and make those assessments and enable the payer community then to make those payment decisions. The importance of the patient relevance in the evidence generation is forever at the center in a lot of people's sort of ambitions in terms of medicine's development, but how do you actually translate that to a reality in terms of their engagement, not just at the end stage risk-benefit decision-making process or the safety monitoring once it's authorized, but also upstream in the design and the development of the types of standards and the types of trials that gets done to enable that patient engagement. Another one that was considered very important was the promotion of use of high quality real world data in the decision making. We know that, you know, with the digitalization of healthcare systems in Europe and globally, the amount of data generated on patient treatment outcomes is exponentially increased. And we have got a challenge as a collective regulatory system. How do we engage with that data? How do we utilize it most effectively in our regulatory decision making? Next slide again, please. Interestingly, we had a goal on health threats, and even though we were in the middle of a COVID-19 pandemic, we certainly weren't when we wrote this strategy. And strangely enough, neither the industry nor the academic researchers considered this a priority area. There was an assumption that these would be enabled by investment in the various technologies that we described in the earlier goals. And it's rather ironic that, you know, the health threats themselves were not seen as the primary area of investment. And of course, it just shows that the best laid plans of mice and men can be undone by Mother Nature. And when you're hit with something like COVID-19, we will be engineering this agenda to respond to that for many years to come, I believe. Next slide again, please. The final one, which we had in the goal, was this leveraging research and innovation in the regulatory science space. And you won't be surprised that the academic community felt that these were major priority areas in which to invest in, that we think we can deliver real change in the system. So developing those network-led partnerships, leveraging collaborations between academia and network scientists to address specific regulatory science questions going forward. And this idea about a mutual dissemination and exchange of knowledge and expertise across the network and within the stakeholder community, very much in a two-way process. So some very important items that we're being asked to take forward in the next 5 years. Next slide again, please. So that was really just a very quick run through what our regulatory science agenda and what the academic community, primarily the researchers and the industry, made of it. And what did the agency do? Because to deliver it is a hell of an ask, and it impacts the work of the scientific committees who are in the vanguard, the lead of this strategy, but also the working parties behind, the wider network of assessors, etc. So one of the things that our outgoing executive director, Guido Razzi, did was he reorganized his agency just before he left it and gave it as a gift to the incoming director, Emer Cook, who's just started now this week. And this was very much to try to put us in a good position to implement, deliver on elements within this regulatory science strategy agenda. Next slide again, please. Yeah, thank you. And essentially what we've done is we've had a focus within a consolidated human medicines area on, to the left, scientific evidence generation, a central focus on the therapeutics themselves, because innovation for innovation's sake doesn't have any initial, no real application unless it's applied in a therapeutic context. Then it's interesting, but it doesn't have a real clinical utility. There's a great focus on ATMPs, which spearheads therapeutics, classically in the oncology area, but we're seeing a fantastic innovation now in the COVID-19 response, and always underpinned by the concern for quality and safety standards. And in addition, we have set ourselves up with 4 task forces, and I'll describe them in the next slide very quickly, please. Next one again, please. Thank you. We have a digital business transformation that's trying to take up some of the opportunities and challenges from the whole digitization of work processes. And that's pretty much, it's the mechanics of how we exchange information with each other, how we work on the data sets that's generated, and how we do our sort of our cut and thrust in terms of the actual risk-benefit assessment process itself, which we believe will be enabled by these digital processes. And if you think about it, one of the reasons we're having this virtual conference here today is enabled by such a digital process type operation. Within that, though, the second task force is asked to dive into the data analytics and methods opportunities. Primarily, it's symbolized, people refer to it as big data, but closer to home, we believe the real world evidence, real world data set coming from those healthcare settings is sort of there to be mined rather rapidly. And there is an emphasis in this task force to engage with the challenges in that area. My own task force is dealing with regulatory science and innovation, and the idea is to identify those trends that are going to impact a regulatory system that can only ever adapt to what those scientific-led changes is taking us to. It's never possible, I believe, to get ahead of those, quite simply because it's very difficult to predict those sciences, but those scientific innovations a priori, but at least you can have a system that is responsive and tries to adapt itself to accommodate those changes. That's at least the ambition. And then finally, making room for those innovative clinical type studies and manufacturing strategies, particularly exemplified by the ATMPs. They just do not conform to the traditional sort of clinical development model that we might have been used to in the 80s and 90s in the last century. They're certainly not the 21st century model that we have to adapt to. So that's essentially what the agency has done to try to meet the challenges of delivering this ambitious regulatory science agenda. Next slide again, please. And it's not in isolation. There is a network strategy that's coming out, and that involves all of the agencies, both human and vet in Europe. That's going to be signed off by the end of this year as well. Within that, you will see the third item there, innovation, and that's where the regulatory science strategy is a heavy emphasis on the innovation sort of pillar, as it were, as well as the data analytics and digital tools. But there are many other challenges that the network system, like we have in Europe, has to deal with: availability and access of medicines, the supply chain challenges. Think of the discussion on the COVID-19. We're all super happy with the vaccine effectiveness scores coming out this week and last, but now it's moving on to the logistical challenges. And similarly, both of these strategies fit under the European Commission's pharma strategy, which has got a longer timeline of reflection, 5 to 10 years even, in terms of putting in place changes to adapt the European system. And again, as well as the international dependency and manufacturing type themes and access to affordable medicines, you will find the innovation agenda very much at the heart of that pharma strategy. And certainly our regulatory science strategy seeks to influence that and will be part of the delivery of that ambition in the European space. Next slide again, please. Yeah. I wanted to come back to very quickly the ambition to leverage research and innovation in regulatory science, knowing that the network in the Netherlands is quite strong in this area. Next slide again, please. Yeah, we know that we're looking at Horizon Europe now replacing the Horizon 2020 program. The amount of money that's on the table is incredible. We're looking at 100 billion plus, and a substantial proportion of that will be dedicated to at least the healthcare, medicinal product, device technology, life science area. Next slide again, please. We need to have a conversation to direct that regulatory science type investment, and that has got to be a collaborative conversation. There are a number of potential areas that we came across as a sort of byproduct of this regulatory science strategy evolution. For the sake of time, I don't have time to go to any of these areas in any detail here, but just to sort of stimulate the discussion further on, these are the types of areas that we believe that need regulatory science research in Europe that enables the regulator to move and evolve the ecosystem. Next slide again, please. An example of that, this isn't just sort of nice aspirational talking. If you look down to some of the work that we've been doing in the area of COVID, this is where it's real collaboration with academic centers to generate a product that the regulatory system can use. And of course, I was very selective to pick the Utrecht University to study the impact of COVID infection in medicines in pregnancy. And this will be part of the real world monitoring of those vaccines that we hope to be approving in the weeks and months to come. And indeed, that will be on the table for Sabine and her colleagues as they exercise the oversight of those COVID-19 products. If you just drop below that line there, you have the various scientific advice and the contact of 148 potential treatments and 36 potential vaccines. The response from the industry globally has been tremendous, has been absolutely amazing. And much and all as it appears to be a bit of a short-term headache to do everything in a concerted time period, it is an amazing response, a public health challenge that it's a great problem to have. Let's put it that way, guys. Next slide again. I just wanted to finish another example of how we're reaching out to academia. Apart from those specific contracts with the University of Utrecht in that space, we have recently launched this collaborating expert program to work on a whole host of specific questions in the regulatory science area. And I would invite you to sort of look at our website under that area and see whether or not you or your institution, the relevant people on the call here today, might be interested in collaborating in seeking some answers in those areas. This is, as I said at the beginning, with that pyramid, you know, regulatory science underpins everything we do with the guidances and the risk-benefit decision-making, but without that collaboration, particularly from the academic center, it's not possible that the regulators alone can deliver this. We really do have to collaborate with our wider stakeholder community. Next slide again, and I think it's the last one to be pleased to know. Coming up, hopefully. No. Doesn't like it. I think I can leave it there, Chair, if that's good enough. Yeah.
It's throwing an error, Tony. It won't let me go forward your slide.
Okay, I don't know. It's not a bad place to end, though. Like, I'll pass the floor with that.
Is there a link in there, Tony? Are you linking somewhere?
I don't honestly, I don't know what there may be links to our website indeed in terms of
there's an HTML buried in the slide, Tony. I'm sorry about that.
That's a technical problem from my end, but Sabine, Chair, if you're happy, that's a good place to end there, which is an open invitation to collaborate, to address, to answer some of these really critical regulatory science questions.
There you go.
I got around it.
Okay. The last one then was a regulatory science cooperation. What we said before was, okay, it's an agenda for the European Medicines Agency. It's driven by the scientific committees and the working parties. That represents the network in Europe, but we know we don't do it alone. We are requested to think internationally. Development is global. Public health challenges are global. And there's a commitment that we develop this regulatory science agenda globally through all of the various structures that we have. And trust me, Chair, that really is the final slide. And I now pass back to you, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Tony. Also, the other slide was quite nice to end with the call for collaboration, I think. Thank you very much for providing a nice overview of the ambitions from European Medicines Agency on the science and on how to try to make that work. I received some information that Bert would like to have a question. So please, over to you, Bert.
Just thank you, Sabine, and quickly, and Tony, thank you so much for this wonderful address. In the beginning, you mentioned this whole filtering process because you had this huge and rich collection of ambitions, ideas, perspectives, etc. at a certain moment that filtered out based also on various consultations, etc. What was, in your view, a major driver of that in that filtering process? Was it the public health perspective, of the regulatory innovation perspective? What was the critical factor that brought you to the set you have now in place?
I think it's the focus. I mean, to some extent within the strategy itself, we still have preserved the 5 strategic goals. And if we went on what we heard from our stakeholders, we wouldn't have a public health threats goal, which of course would be a big hole in our strategy. So we're quite glad that, you know, to some extent we weren't fully led by that. But there is no doubt that the emphasis is on the whole business of the scientific advice with regards to the development programs and the ecosystem for clinical trials, for studies of the whole clinical trial sort of approach, and whether or not Europe has got the flexibility and the ability to adapt to enable some of these innovative clinical trial designs that will be enabled by technology, whether that's decentralized clinical trials, whether it's technology enabled with regards to the digital therapeutics so that you can collect a whole host of type of data, whether it's adapting to patient-reported outcomes, you know, and putting those patient-reported outcomes at a much more central position with regards to the risk-benefit decision-making. It was that sort of early stage direction to how can you respond? How can we in Europe make our regulatory system open to embrace these very, very innovative approaches? Because, you know, the model that we have is the sort of high volume, you know, sort of large scale diseases, high number type treatment type perspective. It has its roots, as you well know, back in the 60s and the 70s from last century. And the real issue is that isn't the type of, with the revolution in biology and the move from sort of, you know, factory production to more sort of life science sort of laboratory type production, much smaller scale, much more targeted, much more personalized. The challenge then will be, how do we evolve our regulatory framework to accommodate that? And I think it wasn't that nobody has any problem with the idea of investing in ring fencing resources for a pandemic response or anything like that. But the whole idea was that unless you enable the technology, unless you catalyze that technology, then those responses will be hampered. And if you think about even the couple of vaccines that have been in the news the last couple of weeks, the RNA technology, I mean, that's brand new technology. So it's great that it's going to get its you know, it's going to be bedded in, and it'll have many other applications in the oncology setting, etc. And we as a system have got to evolve to accommodate that. So I really think that's been the driver. The other very strong message was, you know, our traditional data provider has been the industry with these very I wouldn't say non-real world clinical trial type settings by virtue of us chasing a sort of efficacy assessment. But the idea of enriching that perspective with post-authorization real world data, real world efficacy, as well as safety data to enrich our understanding of the performance of these medicines going forward, that was the other big theme. And the idea that data is there, it's unstoppable in terms of its emergence. And the real issue is, how are we going to adapt to deal with it? So in a sense, you know, you can simplify it to say it's all about the data, which I think it is, the evidence generation, if you like. But I think we're being challenged to adapt both ends of that evidence generation curve. Over.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you very much. And you will stay with us during the whole program. So, because in the chat there have been quite some additional questions, but in view of the time, I think we have a very full and rich program. So if we try to delay already now, it might become very difficult, but it's good if colleagues online who have posed their questions, they will be in the chat, and we can come back to that later, either in the discussion or when Tony has some final remarks based on the information provided. So that would be great, Tony. Thank you very much for this interesting presentation. And I would like to go to the next presentation, which is with Marjon Pasmooij, and she will present to us the experience from the Dutch agency on regulatory science collaboration in the Netherlands. So please over to you, Marjon, to enlighten us on the national aspects of regulatory science in the Netherlands.
Thank you, Sabine, for your very kind introduction. So I was asked to talk about 1 decade of regulatory science collaboration in the Netherlands and the experience from the Medicines Evaluation Board. And I think it's a great fit with Tony and his presentation from the European Medicines Agency side. And in the next coming 15 to 20 minutes, I would like to convince you that working together with different stakeholders is key in regulatory science research. And not only in the research, but also bringing it forward and making a change in the regulatory system. So how did it all start? The founding father and mother of regulatory science at the Medicines Evaluation Board. It started in 2011 with the formation of the Science Office, and Professor Bert Leufkens and Dr. Christine Gispe were important in this setting up of the Science Office. And Professor Bert Leufkens, also the chair of the Regulatory Science Network Netherlands, was also professor in regulatory science at the University of Utrecht. And what they did was started with a report on knowledge management, and that it's important to improve our assessments. So it is not so it's part of our regulatory work, and we need to do this research to be fit for purpose and also for the future, and also to know what is coming and the innovation that is coming to us. So 3 domains were identified that were important along the drug development life cycle. Development and innovation, mainly around preclinical developments, regulation and decision making, and consumer use and safety, focused on pharmacovigilance. And all these 3 domains were found to be important. And later on, when I tell you a little bit more about the different PhD projects that are going on, I will zoom in on what is currently going on each of these domains. So sharing the experience, I would like to present you some figures and facts of those 10 years. And what we are doing is that we host bachelor and master students for internships at our agency, varying from about 10 students until the last 2 years, about 25 students each year. And those internships, the students have their own research project, and it's focused from, or it is from 5 weeks, but mostly to 5 or 6 months that they're staying at their agency. And for us, it is also a good way to learn from them, and them from us, but also a good way to recruit new employees, and especially also from the last 25 students, about 3 or 4 started to work also at our agency. So with the PhD students, we are involved currently in about 19 different PhD projects. And those projects, the majority of the students work as an assessor 50% of the time, and the other 50% of the time they perform their research at the university. And this is crucial for the knowledge exchange between the academia and our agency. And also the co-promoter team is also always a collaboration from the university and the MEB. So where do these PhD projects focus on? For the development and innovation, it's mainly around replacement, reduction, and refinement of animal studies. And there are currently 4 different PhD students working on that. And later on, when I provide an example of one of the research topics, I will focus also on these 3 R's. For the regulation and decision making, a lot of the topics that were already mentioned in the regulatory science agenda of the EMA are coming back here as well. So the registries and the real world data, that is important for the regulatory decision making. How can we use that? Personalized medicine, we see especially for the oncology, more and more trend on biomarkers, estimates, that's about the statistical analysis of clinical trials, generics, and the early approval and the uncertainties that are met with that. Regarding the last domain, that is mainly focused on pharmacovigilance, risk communication, medication errors, and pharmacovigilance specifically of biologicals, among others used during pregnancy. And one of the topics is on medicine shortages, that is especially the last years become more and more apparent. If you want to, I will not go into detail, of course, because of the time into all these topics, but if you want to learn more, please go to our regulatory science magazine. The link is on the right side below, and then you can read more details. I would like to mention that we participate also in different IMI and Horizon 2020 projects, and we think this is very important. These are the IMI projects are from public-private partnerships with academia and different industry partners, and that the regulatory agencies are also present in there to make sure that what is developed can later also be used in regulatory practice. All these research activities, of course, result in different publications, and would like to show you that especially when the science policy, after the start of the science policy in 2011, you can see a sharp increase of these different publications resulting into 50 or 60 per year. So we don't do this together, certainly not. For the different PhD projects, we work together closely with 8 Dutch universities, and to put it into perspective, we have 13 different universities in the Netherlands, so more than half of the universities we work together with, and also with the University of Copenhagen. We have a close collaboration, also student exchange. Of course, with the European Medicines Agency and the national agencies in collaboration of national agencies in Europe, the HMA and ICMRA is on a global level. Different governmental partners, the Medical Ethical Committee and Health Technology Assessment and Health Inspectorate, different registries, and of course also here the Regulatory Science Network Netherlands, where the MEB was a partner from the start, because we think it's a very important neutral platform to discuss topics on regulatory science where multiple partners and stakeholders are involved in. So now it became the difficult part, because I was asked to make a selection of one of the research topics to tell a little bit more what was achieved. And that was a difficult choice, but I would like to start with an example of the animal replacement reduction research. So since the thalidomide 2 species were required for testing of reproductive toxicity, the rat and the rabbit. But the question was in the research, are both species needed? Because from phase onwards in the international guideline S5, there was an embryo fetal development dose range finding study asked, and later embryo fetal development in both species. But then analysis of 380 pharmaceuticals with rat and rabbit showed that the rat and rabbit were relatively equal in sensitivity, and also the severity incidence was similar. So if they are comparable, you should be able to just use one of those species, and that is actually exactly what happened. In a new ICH S5 revision, it is proposed to use one species for dose range finding, and then in vitro studies are sufficient before phase 3, plus safety measures in phase 1-2. So this saves hundreds of thousands less laboratory animals. And there was further research conducted because when there were differences in rat and rabbit toxicity studies, they could also be explained by replication errors and not necessarily by difference in the species sensitivity. So this supports the revision of this guideline. So this is really a topic that that the MEB and also the Dutch Ministry of Health feel strongly about, And we have recently received a grant from the European Partnership for Alternative Approaches to Animal Testing, where we will investigate criteria on the need and duration of monoclonal antibodies, the non-clinical safety studies. And I think it's also important to mention in that research, the pharmaceutical companies have willingly filled in questionnaires to give additional data on the animal studies that they're conducted, so we can do the analysis. So that shows again that it's important to have all stakeholders on board to get the important information. So the second topic I would like to mention is the PhD project of Pieter Glerum. He is working as an assessor, pharmacokinetic assessor at the MEB, and also doing his research on generics. And drug switching is common in the Netherlands. And Pieter Glerum provided an overview in his research on the different drug switches of 20 active substances. And the active substances on the right side can be seen and matched with color in the figure. And as you can see, in the beginning of the year, there are a lot of drug switches in the Netherlands. And in the Netherlands, you have a preference policy to the lowest or cheapest generic, and that makes that a lot of changes are there. His research has been instrumental in discussions with the Ministry of Health and different partners in the last years. And the Ministry of Health has now also commissioned the MEB to set up an overview on medicines for which drug switching is unwanted. And so you could think about medicines, generics with different excipients, or medicinal products with a narrow therapeutic window. And those criteria are currently set up and discussed with patient organizations. The last example that I would like to mention is an ongoing project, the STARS project on strengthening regulatory science and supporting regulatory scientific advice. And why I chose this example, because sometimes it is seen that there's two different roles, the regulatory and the academia, or maybe the funding bodies. At least that's what we heard back recently in a workshop. And that's different languages are spoken, and they didn't refer to Dutch English, but different terminology was used. And I think it's important between different stakeholders to bridge this gap. So in the STARS project, 18 European countries are involved through their national competent authority. And the aim is to reach academic researchers very early in the planning of relevant grant application, and to strengthen long-term regulatory knowledge in general while reaching clinical scientists during professional training and qualification, and thereby improve directly the regulatory impact of the results obtained in academic medical research. And the reason that was done was that in Horizon 2020 funded research to academia, frequently it didn't lead to medicinal products entering the market. And as Tony was showing before, that the funding is increasing, the impact that you have with the funding, you of course would also like to increase. So we have lately sent out questionnaires to funding bodies, national agencies, and academia, clinical research centers, and that has led, amongst others, to a paper that has recently came out about the STARS project, and also with proposals to initiatives to bridge this translational gap, and that's where we will be working on in the coming year. So I thought this picture was quite instrumental because of those different languages that you're speaking to one another. But with the STARS, we would like to bridge this gap. And what was mentioned in this workshop were words that like it takes two to tango, and so I think this is very important. So last but not least, what about the future? The MEB strategic business plan 2020-2024 has been published, and we're now currently working on the science policy that is accompanying that, and expected to be published in 2021. We think, and based on our experience, we find it the basis of this science policy will be those PhD trajectories, having one foot, so to say, in the university and the other in academia, because that has brought us a lot. And regarding the topics that we have identified, there are many, and there's still many more, but that we have identified that we think are very important for the upcoming years are the replacement, reduction, and refinement of animal studies, the ATMPs, data-driven assessment that is also involving big data, real-world data, and also new forms of data of wearables and devices, personalized medicine and biomarkers, and with the new medical device regulation coming soon into force, this is also very important, and also for the in vitro diagnostics that are coupled to that comes into force 2022 for the regulatory science research. And as mentioned before, generics, the proper use in clinical practice, and safety and efficacy after registration. And I think everyone became very nervous from the picture on the right side, because in COVID times, this is certainly not possible to do that. But I thought it is a very great picture of collaboration. And hopefully in 2021, we will be able to do this again. After the vaccines, they have certainly high efficacy, what seems to be. And we can really not only work together remotely, but really work together, being together and sharing our knowledge. So having that said, I would like to thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marjon, for a very nice look into the kitchen of the Dutch agency. And I think you highlighted with your 3 examples, very nice, very different aspects of regulatory science, very helpful. I have received a question, and that's regarding the students. Could you maybe elaborate a little bit on the background of the students? Is it only pharmacy students, or do you have students from a different background?
Yeah, that's a very good question. We have a lot of students from pharmacy background, biomedical sciences, and drug innovation. But actually recently we have also 2 students who from a legal background because of really policy and regulations. And we recruited now also a student because we wanted to look in genomic profiling and more on ATMPs, and from Wageningen University on biotechnology. So just to give an indication, we had now 30 to 35 students applying for the beginning of next year, and maybe we can host like 12, 13 students, and then we make a selection. But if there are no students fitting the profile, then we also put out an advertisement.
Thank you, that's very helpful. So the background is getting more and more heterogeneous, which is very nice. And I have another question in the chat. It is for you, but I don't know, you can give it a try. What is proper use in clinical practice? It's a very broad question, but you can give it a try.
We have a program that's called like that, and it is mainly also sharing the information that we have as an MEB, and better to the healthcare professionals. And also what we do is that for the patients, we're making a patient leaflet of 1 page with the most important information on there. So those are, it's very broad, of course, what can fall under this, but those are important things that we are conducting under this proper use. So it's a lot of information sharing, and also quite a big IT component, so that the information that is that we have is also shared to other healthcare professionals.
Thank you very much, Marjon. I think maybe we have later on in the discussion also a bit more time to go into that, because indeed it's a very broad topic, and MEB is also in that field very active. So thank you very much for that, and thank you for keeping very well within the time limit. So excellent. I think that's a good start for the workshop. We have the next speaker, which is Jarno Hoekman, and he will present to us how to get from collaboration to innovation. And I think interactions between stakeholders that might change during the life cycle is one of the topics that you're going to touch upon. So please, over to you, Jarno.
Thank you very much, Sabine, for your kind introduction. In the next 20 minutes or so, I would like to provide you with some insights in the role of collaboration and networking in regulatory science and innovation. And as the previous speakers already have mentioned, collaboration and networking are a constitutive part of innovation processes, both if we talk about therapeutic innovation and if we talk about regulatory innovation. And I think the previous speakers also already clearly indicated that networking plays an increasingly important role in this respect as a dedicated regulatory science activity and increasingly also as a strategy for organizations to pursue. And what I would like to do in this presentation is kind of contextualize some of these observations and make the point that the increasingly important role of network activities actually also lead to a new set of academic perspectives, you could say, on how regulatory science actually is conducted. And I aim to present some of these perspectives, starting from my own background in the field of science, technology, and innovation studies. And I will also address, by doing so, some questions about what role collaborative networks can play in actually changing regulatory science. And let me also emphasize from the outset there that I do not have any definitive answers to these questions necessarily, but I hope that these reflections and ideas that stem from kind of a long tradition of research on this matter in many different industries and also in many different from many different fields can help to stimulate discussions on the issue and to for the remainder of the dialogue today. And I think that's also why we're here. So the starting point of the talk then is that what we often see if we talk about the discourse around innovation and research is that often what is being mentioned is that biomedical advancements, and this is a widespread perception, that new ideas and advancements and innovations in the field do often not fit well with existing regulatory frameworks. And to illustrate that a bit, take for instance a couple of claims that are being made with regard to gene and cell-based therapies in the literature. So for instance, it's often mentioned that although expectations are high in this field, that there are concerns about the rate of translation of these therapies. And sometimes these concerns are then explicitly linked to so-called regulatory misfits. So one of these papers on this slide mentions, for instance, healthcare system and infrastructure, as well as regulatory systems have emerged to accommodate conventional therapies based on drugs and devices, and may then be poorly suited to the governance and delivery of regenerative medicine. Or if we make that concrete in the context of marketing approvals of new advanced therapies, then we see, for instance, that concerns are being expressed about that clinical trial activity do not necessarily always translate in regulatory marketing approvals, and that the number of approvals is relatively disappointed when compared with clinical trial activity. Now, along similar lines, we see also these concerns when we talk about the use of innovative tools and new tools to support regulatory decision-making. And the starting point here is often that predictions suggest that the development and approval of complex biologicals, ATMPs, and drugs for orphan diseases will accelerate over the coming decade. So this is despite the translational problems they face. For instance, it has been estimated that by 2025, 10 to 20 new gene therapies will be approved each year. And it is anticipated that this shift in kind of the nature of therapies also needs kind of a co-evolution in terms of the ways of evidence generation. And a couple of these new ways of evidence generation are pictured here on the slide, including innovative trial designs, model-informed drug development, real-world evidence, biomarker use, new forms of risk-benefit assessment. However, I mean, if you look at the debates around how such co-evolution trajectories actually should be shaped and how new tools can be translated from ideas to implemented innovation and can be used in a robust way in regulatory decision-making, then we see a lot of debates between stakeholders on how this trajectory can be shaped. And if we kind of make a very general statement here, we can say that what we face here is a so-called pacing problem. And a pacing problem are situations where research and innovations might happen so fast that they kind of almost outpace the ability of regulatory science and regulation and laws to keep up. And this includes cases where laws might already be present to try to capture the innovation, but it's very difficult to translate them to the complex context of individual therapeutic development trajectory. And there are two elements to that problem. So first one can say that if we think about a pacing problem, that we can say that research and innovation moves faster than regulation. That's one part of the claim that's being made. And the second part of that claim is that it is about the role of researchers, innovators, and other stakeholders vis-a-vis regulators. Put differently, the extent to which research and innovation is distanciated from regulators and regulation, and vice versa, to what extent regulation can actually capture research and innovation activities that happen at the frontier. Now, if we look at how we can kind of address this particular problem, what we increasingly see is an emphasis on network instruments. So we already heard the introduction of the European Medicines Agency regulatory science strategy, which, for instance, emphasis the developing interactions between academia and EU regulatory network is important for delivering the strategic agenda of the regulatory science agenda. And moreover, there are a couple of very concrete instruments related to that, which are about more regular and iterative engagement between regulators, funders, and research centers in so-called network-led partnership. It's about collaborations between regulators, academia, and learned society. And it's about open knowledge exchange and dissemination in shared and open environment. And this, of course, complements already ongoing initiatives in the field. As regulatory science has always been a very much collaborative effort, as we also just heard from Marjon explaining the regulatory science program of the Dutch MEB, and other instruments that are there, such as, for instance, at the EMA level, the Innovation Task Force, early scientific advice, collaborations in large-scale public-private partnerships, such as, for instance, the Innovative Medicine Initiative, and the Horizon 2020. And the increased emphasis on networking raises a number of questions with regard to how we can think about the role of these networks in regulatory science. And these include, for instance, questions on how these networks are constituted, how their structure changes over time, and how these networks influence the rate and direction of regulatory change in the system. And in the next 10 minutes or so, I would like to present some insights on this, mainly drawing from the field of science, technology, and innovation. So first of all, we can say that these networks are really about acknowledging the importance of interactive learning between a diverse set of stakeholders and organizations. And this is particularly important given that we deal here with situations where we are tackling complex problems, and we operate in a concrete problem-solving context. And in the scientific literature, this is often referred to as Mode 2 knowledge production or triple or quadruple helix models of innovation. And diversity can here be understood in terms of different stakeholders involved, in terms of different knowledge and expertise on the table, in terms of different geographical representations, but also in terms of experience. For instance, in the case where young regulatory scientists are being trained. And what we can learn from innovation theory here is that it is not just about pursuing diversity. So what we often see when we look at these networks and how they are constituted, that there are kind of optimal levels of diversities in these networks, and that the diversities that are being sought for need to be very close to the problems that actually need to be addressed. And often we see also trade-offs there. Because, for instance, if networks are very diverse in terms of the stakeholders involved, they might be less diverse in terms of the geographies they cover. Or when there are many different disciplines involved, then there might be less stakeholders involved. So somehow in this networking, in the constitution of these networks around research and development, we often see optimal levels of diversity. And this also makes sense because this is necessary in order to come to a common understanding and to reach this common language that need to be spoken, as Marjon already introduced in her talk. Another way of looking at this is that the functioning of the networks really depend on who is brought together in a network and on the nature of the issue that needs to be addressed. And individuals and organizations who contribute in these networks often come with very different backgrounds to the table. So they have different drivers for doing what they do. They have different beliefs and values and might also have different interests. And as a consequence of that, they will assess the innovation or the problem or the solution that is kind of the focus of the particular topic of the particular and that needs to be addressed within the network. They will assess that innovation in a different way. And sometimes in the innovation literature, we refer to those assessments as kind of evaluation frames or assessment frames. And then we talk, for instance, about how individuals categorize a technology or a problem relative to other technologies, which performance criteria they use to judge a particular technology or a particular tool as valuable, and also what their expectations are about how this will develop in the future and the desirability of the particular innovation that is being developed. And here I provide some prototypical ideas of this. So scientists will reason more from a knowledge production logic or from a fundament and think about values in terms of fundamental understanding, predictive values, validity. From an innovation perspective, an emphasis will be more, for instance, on user needs, market values, and how to make organizations ready for implementation. From a regulatory perspective, it's often about legitimacy, accountability, democracy, and also proportionate measures with respect to conflicts of interest. From a clinical perspective, the emphasis will be on the individual patient health and well-being and quality of life and access to care. And in those collaborations, the idea, of course, is to bridge those different evaluation frames and connect them, so to bring this together. And one thing which is important in this respect that's often being mentioned is that this can, of course, science and methodological sophistication is important here, but this is also largely about building trust and being able to reflect on that different parties in such collaborations, have different starting positions, have different beliefs, drivers and values, and trying to come together and be able to connect across those boundaries. And that's sometimes what's being called boundary spanning capabilities, which are very much of importance in those types of networks. Another perspective on this, and that's the second point I would like to make, is that which relates to the distinct role of networking over the innovation lifecycle. And what we can say there is that the structure of networks, as well as the questions that are being addressed, are expected to change over the innovation lifecycle. And one way to look at this is starting from some existing frameworks that are out there in the literature, mainly in the innovation management literature, and that have been around for a very long time and have been also shown to work for many different types of industries. And these frameworks suggest that innovations often go through 3 different distinct phases. And in the first fluid phase, there the emphasis is often mostly on the radical aspect of the innovation itself. And this is radical in terms of a new therapy or a new tool. And often what we see in this phase that there is considerable variety in different designs, and there's a lot of uncertainty about the exact problem that will be addressed from a technological perspective, but also from a market or a regulatory perspective. And in this phase, networks are often relatively fragmented and they are slowly being formed. In the second phase, what we see is that some of the designs are actually being selected and become dominant in the network. And the designs become also subject of experimentation and standardization efforts. And what we see then is that innovation around these designs shifts from a purely focus on the product to also focus on the process. So how to produce the innovation and how to deliver it. And networks then rapidly develop, particularly around those parties that are very much involved in developing and evaluating the selected designs. So the networks develop, but they might also become more selective. And finally, what we see is a consolidation phase. And what we see there is that there is a phase of widespread uptake, mainstreaming of the innovation, and further optimization. So here in this phase, networks further consolidate, but they do not develop much further, or do not necessarily become much more expanded. Now, if we think about, and this is definitely not an exhaustive slide, but the idea is to think about how can you then kind of conceptualize the dynamics of these networks and the considerations that could go in this over different phases of the life cycle. And in general, one can say that the uncertainty and the need for networking is highest in the earliest phase. And the idea is that when the networks that are being formed, it's important to clearly clarify the problem, identify all relevant stakeholders, and discuss the value of the innovation, starting with the end in mind. And incentivizing of diversity is very important here in the sense that at this stage, there might be many different design varieties, but at the same time, there might be very limited incentive for some stakeholders to contribute because the exact problem definition might not be completely, might not be fully clear at that moment. It's also important here to prevent early lock-in, that is to settle on one of the design and disregarding others, which might later turn out to be a suboptimal design. So here it's very important to be open in terms of the networks that can be formed. And once in the network development phase, what we see is that networks become denser and more focused, for instance, concrete around a specific drug development context. And here what we see is that real-life engagement is at stage in the context of these projects. And there it's important to include these rate-limiting steps to make sure that at sufficient moments during that process, one can kind of can reflect on the strengths and weaknesses of the chosen approaches in interaction with different type of stakeholders, both those involved in developing them, as well as more on the evaluation side, for instance, in consultation procedures. And finally, the third phase is then about grounding the approach in guidelines and best practices. So that's really about codifying what has been learned and also about further disseminating this. And here it's important to be to have continued openness in the network, because what often problems we see here is that the experience are shared between a group of developers or a group of stakeholders that are already very much aware of what's going on, and they can easily navigate through the regulatory system, while others have difficulties have more difficulties to contribute. So that's really, here it's really important to make sure that what has been learned is also sufficiently shared with everyone who can benefit from it. Now, a final point I would like to make is really about monitoring, and that's the third point that about the role of network, is really about monitoring and evaluating the role of these networks in regulatory science. And as Marjon already introduced, is that the Dutch regulatory science community has a long tradition of researching and providing insight in the functioning of the regulatory system itself. And networks forged by regulatory science strategy provide a potential new study object in this respect. So, it could be valuable to evaluate these networks. And examples of networks that can be the subjects of such evaluations have already been mentioned also in the previous talk. So they include public-private partnerships, such as the Innovative Medicines Initiatives, where a lot of stakeholders are brought together, but also various networking and early engagement initiatives of regulatory authorities, such as the Innovation Task Force, early scientific advice procedures, regulatory funded studies, network-led partnerships, and other forms of network. And it's important in this respect to acknowledge that regulatory science is already a highly networked activity. And this is for instance visible from this network graph of collaborations between organizations on 876 publications that have been co-authored by the European Medicines Agency over since its initiation. And monitoring of how these networks evolve, what stakeholders are included, what partners are selected, who contributes, both in terms of cognitive dynamics, that is, which fields are represented and which fields are not represented, in terms of stakeholders involved, and also geographies involved, but also, for instance, the expertise involved could be an interesting avenue for future studies in this. And it seems relevant here to pay specific attention to what type of experts are actually chosen and contribute in these networks, and which experts do not contribute, and also the reasons for why this is the case, and whether there is kind of possibilities to optimize this. Now, monitoring can also be done purely along thematic lines or with respect to fields. And this is a simple example of a heat map, and this is very much exploratory, but a heat map of all kinds of terms that you can find in publications where regulatory agencies have been involved. In this case, the European Medicines Agency have been involved in writing. So this might give a picture of the particular themes that regulatory agencies are already engaging with. And also, again, this can be linked to fields or disciplines or different problems that need to be addressed, and those cases where this is not. Now, of course, publication activity, then this is very much an exploratory type of exercise. Publication activities are only one way of looking at this. And that goes without saying that if you would like to pursue this research line, it needs it needs clear qualitative backing in the actual work that is going on, and the actual goals and ambitions of the different stakeholders involved, as well as maybe other quantitative data. So not only, as was shown by the previous speaker, not only looking at the regulatory science activities as reflected in publications, but also how this translates up in the pyramid. So in terms of how this translates into scientific advisory committees, how this translates actually in regulatory dossiers, and what type of new methods are actually being used. So the uptake of methods and in what context actually methods are being used is another avenue which merits more attention in that respect. And that brings me to kind of the summary of my talk. So I have discussed how the relation between regulation and innovation in regulatory decision-making tools and therapeutics can be understood as a pacing problem, and how networks are now increasingly used in attempts to address this problem. And three perspectives may then be particularly helpful to understand the role of these networks in regulatory science activities. First is a network perspective, network diversity perspective. And here emphasis can lie on the boundary spanning capabilities that are needed to bring a diverse set of actors together around a concrete problem. Second is a network dynamics perspective. And here one can think about how the importance of networks and what specific questions to address in these networks are important over the innovation lifecycle. And finally, there are questions about evaluation and monitoring. And here it's really both about knowledge, so understanding the knowledge dynamics, as well as how networks can use to build trust between parties and to leverage the value of collaboration. So thanks for your attention, and I'm very happy to receive questions, and please also reach out to me if you would like to.
Thank you very much, Jarno, for a very interesting presentation and a very nice way of looking at networking and that you have all kinds of difference. I especially like the one with the life cycle approach and which kind of networks you need. I have received several questions, one from Sharpot, but I think that is very suitable for the discussion later on because it discusses the relation between this presentation and the science agenda from EMA. So that would be very nice for the later on discussion when also Tony is available. But the other question was, and I'm also curious to know that, is could you give an example of an innovation which is currently in the fluid phase?
Yeah, that's a good that's a very good question, and I think you could say that artificial intelligence is one of them, where it is very much unclear what the exact contribution of that technology will be in addressing problems, and there are multiple. I mean, there's a lot of variety in designs because if we talk about artificial intelligence, we can think about a lot of different things. We can think about machine learning. We can think about big data. We can there are many more sophisticated way of thinking about this. But how this can actually be leveraged in the context of concrete drug development, but also in terms of regulatory evaluation of products, is very much unclear. So I would say that's an innovation that's still in the fluid phase. Another example you could say is that advanced therapies have been in the fluid phase for a long time, but are now moving out of this because there are some kind of designs emerging around which many innovation activity take place. For instance, CAR-T is one of those developments where we now see that there is some of these kind of standardization taking place, and you also see then that investments flock in around these dominant designs. But for a long time there were questions about what actually is it what we have, and how do we categorize it, and how does for instance tissue engineering also fit in, and how are gene and cell-based therapies different from each other, and is this something we should regulate from the EMA side, or is this a drug, or is this a device, and is this a product or a process, and all these kind of categorization questions, or these fluid questions where you cannot really capture the innovation, as to say, that would be another example.
Thank you. I think it's been very helpful to have a little bit more background, and I think it's something that will be very helpful in our further discussions. I also have lots of questions on the pacing problem, but that's for later on. We have now the last speaker before the break, and that's the perspective from the industry. And Korte will present to us the collaboration and regulatory science from an industry perspective. So please, over to you.
Hello, Paul, you might be muted. If you could unmute yourself.
Yeah, there I am. Thank you very much, Sabine, for giving me the opportunity to have this presentation. And as a starting off, I think this presentation very much connects with the presentation by Jarno. Because the key message that I would like to convey with my presentation is that, regulatory science is very much about collaboration in networks, because collaborations bring innovations, but it should also be about implementation. If you cannot valorize science, if you cannot pick the fruits of science, then what is it all worth for? So my presentation will very much focus on this, what I would like to call the valorization of regulatory science. And I also like to start with a sort of disclaimer. I'm not in a function of regulatory affairs. I'm very much more in the governmental and external relations, which means that I will take a more of an outside-in perspective. And it's a bit like I'm standing at, let's say, the outside of the swimming pool, whereas the whole regulatory science takes place underwater. So what I will do, I will also submerge and see how this collaboration takes place, but constantly will take this outside-in look. Okay, so before I want to go into the regulatory science itself, I think it's very good to have a sort of outside view about a few very important, at least in my opinion, trends that are going on in the outside world. And there are three of them. One has to do with the, let's say, the technological developments, one with societal developments, and another one which has more to do with, let's say, political, economical, and geopolitical developments. So starting with the first one, if we talk about the industry, if we talk about, say, the industry perspective, it is not only about, let's say, the pharmaceutical industry in the classical sense. If we talk about regulatory science, we should look at not the industry in itself, but as the whole ecosystem in which big pharma companies, smaller pharma companies, spin-offs, spin-outs are collaborating in a private public ecosystem. And it's not only about companies and spin-offs that are looking for new drugs, but it's very much also about companies that develop enabling technologies that somehow find their way into drug development, and also because of that find a way into, let's say, the regulatory system and the regulatory framework. And this can be, let's say, the hardware part of technology, like biotechnology, like medical devices, like all kinds of digital hardware. But it's also very much about the software side. So new methodologies, artificial intelligence, data sciences, new concept of doing clinical trials. And it's also this convergence, like also Jarno pointed out, of these technologies, medical devices combined with diagnostics, with drugs, etc., etc. So this is in fact let's say the technological, the industry broad background that we should take into account. Besides the technological developments, there's a second one which I feel is very important, and it has everything to do with the societal perspective. I mean, we're in the midst of the COVID crisis, and I mean, it's really something special that because of joint efforts, we are able to reduce the normal development time of a COVID vaccine from 10, 15 years to 1 year, through a very joint effort by companies, by also joint efforts between companies and regulators, the clinical trial networks, you name it. In fact, a collaboration all over the world. And this is somehow, reflecting of the call that is coming to us from the greater public to have a safe and an effective vaccine, but also one that comes in very fast. And this somehow has raised a lot of awareness, I feel, about what is drug development and what is taking place in this world of regulatory frameworks, regulatory science. You can open up every newspaper every day, and it's full about people, public, asking questions about, in fact, the work that we are doing. So it not only raises awareness, but probably it will also raise future expectations from society. If we are able to develop a vaccine, let's hope we will have one in a few months' time. But if we are able to develop a vaccine in 1 year, why not are we able also to develop new drugs in oncology, in much shorter times than we usually do? Why not have rolling reviews, not only for vaccines, for healthy people, but also rolling reviews for new drugs for people who suffer from a terrible disease? So besides the technological background, we also take into account the societal part. And then the third one, I think very obvious is, and it has also been because of the COVID crisis, that somehow these weaknesses, these interdependencies that we have within, let's say, the pharmaceutical market and the access to pharmaceuticals has its flaws, has its interdependencies, has its weaknesses. So that's also one of the reasons that the European Commission came with these 4 pillars for the pharmaceutical strategy, seeking guarantee access to affordable drugs for the people in the European Union, at the same time embracing new technologies, and also to support an industry that is a world leader in bringing innovations to the market. So coming back from these, let's say, from this external view to regulatory science, and descending a bit to what we are doing in the Netherlands, if we see how the regulatory science network in the Netherlands, in which the industry also plays an important part in establishing the network and also supporting the network and collaborating in this network. I mean, it's not only those 3 parties that are part of this network. It is very much embedded in this ecosystem that I showed you earlier. So it's also very much in connection with the clinics, with patient organizations, and with the ecosystem as a whole. And I think it's very, because of this very well connections of the network with the Dutch ecosystem, it brings also inside, say, all the activities that are going on, all the new developments, and that might eventually also trigger regulatory science questions. And just as an example, to mention 3 of them, one regarding clinical trials, a very innovative way of looking at clinical trials with the drug protocol, sort of basket type of clinical trial design, which raised the questions, if this investigator-initiated trial brings up new evidence, why not somehow try to bring this also into the label of the drugs that are being studied? Another one on biomarkers, especially in diabetic nephropathy, also very much driven by, let's say, the things that are going on in practice in this Dutch ecosystem, but also about labeling, and the way that the network is looking at all these developments is very much starting in fact at the start, at the bottom, by raising questions how this could impact the regulatory framework, how we could approach these new developments in bringing this to also the regulatory system. So you could say that the regulatory science network, which has only been there for 4 or 5 years, is very much still in this fundamental phase, and maybe in Jarno terms, in this early fluent phase. But the goal is, of course, to bring this further, to bring this to innovation, and to bring this also to implementation. And for that, the question that I would like to raise is, how can we really valorize regulatory science? And I think there are 3 very important things that come into play. The first is, if we really want to have society benefit from the science, also from regulatory science, I mean, it should be very much driven from a mission. The missions, like the societal mission, but maybe also the missions that were being formulated by the European Commission. And if these missions are there, we should define a clear end goal, and as a fact work back and see how we can take steps to reach this end goal. The end goal being implementing these new innovations also into the regulatory framework. And it's brought me to an analogy with, and probably lots of you will know what this is about, with the so-called technology readiness levels that were being developed originally by, I think, by NASA. How to take technologies from different levels, from the start, from the fundamental research, up to the level of where it can be implemented, being validated, being tested into practice. And this framework of TRLs, of technology readiness levels, is also being used in Horizon 2020 and in other ways of financing research. So probably lots of you are familiar with this. So what I was contemplating is, would it be possible to somehow change this concept of technology readiness level into regulatory readiness levels, so that we could somehow project to these networks, to these innovating companies and ecosystem, which steps have to be taken, to get to the end point, where there is a regulatory framework that really embraces these innovations, that can be used in making, the risk benefit balances, and at least have products being approved that way. And if we would do that, we could somehow plot the different activities that are currently going on along these different levels. So suppose we would have a clear definition of what these different levels would be from a regulatory science perspective, and we differentiate between the research part and the development part and the deployment part. What's currently being done in the regulatory science network in the Netherlands could be seen as really the basic research. And if we look at the IMI projects, and I mentioned a few that are being conducted or that have been going on. To mention a few, Get Real and the Get Real initiative that looked at how can we make use of real-world data. They also went through these different levels. Get Real, very much still more explorative. So what's going on in the real-world evidence? What are different topics that should be addressed? Being followed up by another initiative, Get Real initiative, which took it one step further. The same is true for instance, the consortium that's looking under the umbrella of IMI at how we can make use of remote decentralized clinical trials by using digital means to have patients monitored at home instead of doing the trials within the clinical centers, which is also a consortium of different stakeholders, also stakeholders like the regulatory authorities. Another example, which is a quite new project, also an IMI project called EU Pearl, which is doing the same for building new clinical networks, building new platforms, integrative platforms. And this is even a step further in which they try to look for how can we combine, let's say, placebo groups in a clinical setting with different new therapies that are also investigated, instead of having different companies doing for different products, different clinical trials. Why not combine them? And part of this initiative is also to take 4 distinctive disease areas in which these networks are being piloted. So this is, again, one step further, one step higher on the ladder of regulatory readiness. And then I think what is still not maybe very much known territory is, of course, and then it becomes also for both, I think, the companies as well as the regulatory authorities, how can we also find, let's say, the comfort for both parties, for both sides, for both stakeholders, de-risking, and actually get to a new means of working and using these new technologies in real regulatory practice. Because then if we reach that level, then, as I said, society can also benefit from all the work that has been done. So as a sort of conclusion, wouldn't it be something to also have a view on why not bring this valorization part more to the core also of the regulatory science agenda? And with a bit of a cut and paste, I tried to bring the regulatory science part of the strategy of EMA more into the center of the 5 pillars, in order to really be very much let's say not so much pushing new technologies, but really pulling new technologies, new science, so that it can bring better drugs, new technologies in a faster way, in a compliant way, so that also society as a whole, patients, but also our economies in Europe can benefit from all the science and innovations that are taking place. So with that, I would like to end my presentation and give it back to you, Sabine.
Thank you very much, Paul, and very nicely indeed follow up on Jarno's presentation on the pacing problem that is also highlighted here, where you highlight or call it regulatory preparedness. It's very interesting. I didn't see any questions in the chat, but I think that people will need to digest maybe your presentation, and that the questions will be during the discussion opportunity later this afternoon. So we will have now a different kind of presentation. We will have 5 presentations in a little bit less than an hour. Presented by experts on the topic, which is of course a challenge. Presenting something that you like and love in 10 minutes, it's really a challenge. I know that from experience. So I think the best thing to do is to start as soon as possible. The first topic is regulatory science for the crosstalk sessions. It would have been presented by our colleague, Dr. Inge Zomerdijk, but unfortunately, she's not available. And Dr. Liana Gross very kindly agreed to take her place at a late notice, but I'm sure that she will do great. So please, over to you, Liana, to take us through the first 10-minute talk. Please, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sabine, for the introduction. Indeed, I'm very pleased to give this talk about pharmacovigilance, and it's quite challenging to provide an overview on this topic in just 8 minutes, but I will try. Next slide, please. Obviously, pharmacovigilance is a very large science, includes a large variety of topics. Just to mention some of the most important ones is obviously safety monitoring of medicines, post-marketing, including identification of new safety issues, and deciding on the need for implementing risk minimization measures. However, today in my talk, I will focus on the assessment of effectiveness of regulatory actions on the use of medicines and patient outcomes, and especially the situations when these may trigger new or adjusted risk minimization measures for clinical practice. And in order to illustrate this, I have chosen to talk about a case of valproate referral for valproate containing products, as this example illustrates how different methods, different types of data, and engagement of different types of stakeholders may facilitate safety monitoring in pharmacovigilance. Next slide, please. Valproic acid is a quite old medicine which was on the market, which is on the market since early 60s of the previous century, and is indicated to treat epilepsy and manic episodes in bipolar disorders, and also migraine in some of the European countries. Well, it's very old knowledge that this is a teratogenic product. However, in recent years, we became aware of additional risks for children who are exposed to valproate during pregnancy, and these are neurodevelopmental disorders which have even higher prevalence. Basically, half of children exposed to valproate during pregnancy will have some sort of serious problems in future. And this was the reason that in 2014, Pharmacovigilance and Risk Assessment Committee of European Medicines Agency conducted a review, safety review for valproate, and it was decided that there should be additional risk minimization measures to prevent these risks in children, and there were new warnings included in the product information, and there was also the HPC sent out, and a number of educational materials for both healthcare providers and the patients. And one of the important risk minimization measures was the advice to use contraceptive measures whenever a woman of childbearing potential is using valproate. And in general, there is an advice that valproate should not be used as a first choice treatment in any young women, regardless of possibility or chance to become pregnant. The next slide, please. However, in 2017, so basically some 3 years after the review and after implementation of risk minimization measures, we became aware of information that despite all these measures, there are still pregnancies occurring in women who are using valproate, and therefore there was an urgent need to evaluate the effectiveness of the measures that have been implemented in 2014. And so that was the moment that it was decided that we need different type of data to evaluate effectiveness, and we need to engage different stakeholders. The next, please. One more. And one more. Yeah, thank you. And in 2014, Prague requested the marketing authorization holders to conduct healthcare provider survey and drug utilization study to evaluate effectiveness of risk minimization measures. And so this was the moment that the results of the studies started to be assessed. And at the same time, input has been sought from clinical practice, considering the indication of the product. Specifically, input was sought from neurologists, psychiatrists, as well as relevant stakeholders, such as professional organizations at European level, including general practitioners, pharmacists, gynecologists, and other relevant healthcare providers. During this procedure, it was the first time that EMA has made possible a public hearing, and during this public hearing there was a possibility for anyone from the public to submit input, and also to be present physically and provide opinions regarding the risks of valproate and regarding the suggestions for further risk minimization measures. Next, please. Yeah, so the focus of this review and input from different stakeholders was how valproate is used among young women in clinical practice, and different data sources provided some insights how valproate has been used following implementation of risk minimization measures following the review in 2014. Next, please. And one more. So the first public hearing was conducted in 2017, and besides representatives of different healthcare providers, a number of patients or victims of valproate use during pregnancy were present during this meeting, and it was very useful to hear their voices and their input. I would like to highlight two examples that were provided by patients who participated at this public hearing. There was a woman who had a child with severe disabilities because she has been using valproic acid during pregnancy, and she wasn't informed about the risks of valproate during pregnancy, and she provided detailed examples on how life of the whole family, so the child, but also the whole family, has been impacted by the severe consequences. At the same time, there was another woman with a diagnosis of bipolar disorder who provided her input, and she mentioned that she had a wish for having a child, but she never could have a child because she was using valproic acid, and that was the reason that her psychiatrist advised her against becoming pregnant, although there are other medications on the market that could have been used for treatment of her psychiatric condition, and she could have a child if there was a switching of valproate, if this was made possible. Let's go to the next slide. So topics that were included in the second review for valproate included discussion on the medical need of valproate for epilepsy and bipolar disorders during pregnancy, and input that was received from experts, from psychiatrists and neurologists, made it clear for us that especially for epilepsy indication, there are women, there is a subpopulation of patients with certain types of epilepsy who may respond only to valproate. So there was a clear unmet medical need in small but clearly defined population of the patients. And the review of a survey that was conducted among healthcare providers to evaluate their knowledge about the risks and their knowledge about risk minimization measures provided information about the level of knowledge and awareness they had. And during the meetings with different stakeholders, we sought input for improvement of the risk minimization measures. We tried to find out what were the barriers for their effective implementation following the first review, and collected some suggestions. And also some in-depth discussions with patient representatives and patient organizations helped to understand how the patients experienced how the receipt of the educational materials, and how information has been communicated by healthcare providers to the patients at the moment valproate has been prescribed. Next slide, please. So there was a drug utilization study conducted following the first review, and in short, the conclusions of assessment of this study were that the period after implementation of resynchronization measures was rather short to make some firm conclusions, because it was basically only 2 years period. Overall, we saw that there is less valproate being prescribed to women of childbearing potential, especially for epilepsy indication. We couldn't see clear difference in number of pregnancies in women who are using valproate, and it was also very challenging to study use of contraception as an important riskinization strategy in this population, because use of contraceptive methods was not well captured in the databases that were used for this study. Next, please. And the healthcare provider survey showed that the implementation was also not optimal implementation of educational materials, because both the DHPC and educational materials for some reason didn't reach the targeted audience, with only 60% of healthcare providers mentioning that they received this. The analysis of the data showed that in general, healthcare providers who did receive these educational materials had a better understanding of the risks and had a better knowledge on the risk minimization measures to avoid the risk associated with use of valproate during pregnancy. And there were also other data that have been used during this review, in particular some additional surveys and studies conducted on national level in different countries in Europe. And for instance, some studies conducted in UK among patients showed that large majority of women of childbearing potential who are using valproate, they told that they did not receive education materials. And this was a striking difference as compared to what the healthcare providers mentioned, because the majority of prescribers mentioned that they do communicate with their patients about the risks of valproate when this is prescribed to women of childbearing potential. So this has highlighted some discrepancies in how healthcare providers and patients may perceive the risk communication. The next, please. So overall, the conclusions of the second review or referral that was concluded in 2018 were that the benefit risk of valproate remains positive, provided that improved and additional risk minimization measures are implemented. And one of the important measures was the decision to implement contraindication in pregnancy, which was quite challenging considering the fact that some women with epilepsy may not have any other alternative treatment options, and therefore it was made possible that if woman doesn't have any other alternative options, then use of valproate during pregnancy may be possible. A very detailed pregnancy prevention plan has been implemented with the need for detailed counseling. At the moment, valproate is being prescribed to young girls or women of childbearing potential. The target groups for receiving the DHPC and updated educational materials was better defined and was broadened. For instance, besides psychiatrists and neurologists, it was decided that general practitioners and gynecologists should be also involved, and we have tailored a specific educational materials for this group, because GPs and gynecologists may play an important role in counseling and ensuring the use of effective contraception contraception measures in these patients. Then it was very interesting discussion on patient card that had to be implemented and to be given to the patient at the moment. Every time the product is being given to the patient, and it was decided that the patient card should be implemented on the packaging, so on the outer packaging of the product and not inside the packaging, because this would trigger the pharmacist, would be a reminder to the pharmacist to talk one more time to the woman to remind and to check if she's indeed aware of the risks and if she's indeed using contraceptive methods when using valproate. It was also decided that there will be a warning on the outer packaging of valproate containing products. The next slide, please. So I just
Liana, just
yes.
quickly, we are running out of time. If we can wrap this up,
Okay.
that would be great.
Yes, yes. Yeah, so in the Netherlands, we have consulted FARS organization, Dutch Center of Expertise on Health Disparities, and following this consultation, there is a choice made regarding the pictogram. Next, please. To be included on the outer packaging in the Netherlands. What do you see in the box? The text for this box was decided by PRAC and had to be implemented in all countries in Europe. However, the pictogram was optional, and in the Netherlands, following consultation with PAROS, we have made a choice for the left circle pictogram to be provided on the outer packaging. Next slide, please. So this is my last slide. What were the lessons learned? That important point in this procedure was that input from different stakeholders from clinical practice and from the patients was essential during this review. It helped us to understand the most important issue during this procedure is that the risk with valproate is dynamic, and it's not per se present at the moment when the product is being prescribed, because at that moment women may not be in the age of childbearing potential, or she may be in age of childbearing potential, but due to her circumstances, she may not have a chance to become pregnant, and the risk may be less relevant, but that may change. And that's why it was very important to realize that there is a need for more frequent implementation of education and materials, because the information that had been provided several years before when the product was prescribed for the very first time may be lost in future. The next point is that during this review, the combination of different types of data from different sources helped to understand the points that needed further improvement that we took into account during the second review. And this also showed that the studies that are being requested for evaluation of risk minimization measures in pharmacovigilance are providing very useful information that allow us to tailor further implementation of risk minimization measures. Thank you very much. And if there are any questions and time, I'm happy to take them.
Thank you very much, Liana, especially in view of the fact that you also brought the voice of the patient to the table. However, unfortunately, we're eating in the time, we're already 10 minutes late. I anticipated that it would be a challenge to have passionate colleagues talking about their interesting projects, but we will take the questions later on in the discussion if there is an opportunity. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to the next speaker, which is Falk Ehmann, and he will take us through the biomarkers. So thank you very much. Over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Sabine and Bert and Tony, for inviting me to this very interesting conference. So as mentioned, I will talk a bit about biomarker in the next 8 to 10 minutes, a key regulatory tool to facilitate drug development. And next slide, thank you. I have no conflicts to declare. Next slide, please. So connecting to the talk we heard this early morning or this earlier today from Anthony Humphreys on the regulatory science strategy, our Vision 2025, there's a specific chapter on biomarker. And I'd just like to highlight here what we envisage or what the network envisaged, including the stakeholders which we consulted in this area. And this is support the developments in precision medicines, biomarkers, and omics, enhance early engagement, and I'll come later to this. And we shall critically review what we did so far. I have some stats on this one, and we are currently having a colleague as well who looks very much into this, and I have some more data on this later. What is the impact? And we should evaluate this in correlation with the stakeholder and in view of more personalized medicine. Next slide, please. So talking about biomarker, it is quite a well-used broad term, and I think it's extremely important that we talk about the same thing when we present this here. So this is modified from ICH E15, where we talk about genomic biomarker, but I think it's still a good definition. When we talk about a measurable characteristic, that is an indicator of normal, biologic, or pathogenic processes and or response to therapeutic or other interventions. For example, biomarker, even blood pressure can be a biomarker, up to a very complex artificial intelligence using algorithm, self-learning algorithm can be a biomarker as well. So we are talking about a very, very vast spectrum here. And with the 3 pictograms on this slide, I'd like to highlight that biomarker can be developed or exist in any kind, in any stage of development, of drug development. So preclinical, clinical, as well as during drug utilization. Next slide, please. Next slide. Next and next. So thank you. So this is now a procedure basically we as regulators offer in order to qualify biomarkers. So one thing is you discover biomarker, maybe in research in the university or in other labs. The other thing is that this is a validated biomarker, which we can really use or others can use as well in their drug development programs. So the vision of this procedure is to speed up and optimize drug development, utilization, and as such, improve public health. And this procedure is open to everybody, consortia, academia networks, etc., etc. And indeed, we see that a high proportion of our applicants, and I come later to this, are indeed academia and especially consortia, public-private partners, IMI, Horizon 2020 consortia. Now, what is the outcome of these qualification of novel methodologies procedures? There's 2 types. One thing is the qualification advice, which remains confidential and is something like a scientific advice. So basically, we look at the data you provided so far, and we think this is not ready for a specific qualification or validation. The method is not validated yet. The biomarker is not valid for open use yet. But these are the things you need to do to further develop this and to come to a qualification. And the other one is, of course, where we like to guide everybody to, is a qualification opinion, which is on the acceptability of a specific use of context. And this is extremely important. I think most of the time in early interactions with such developers, we talk about you really have to think what is exactly the wording, what is exactly the biomarker you're talking about? How can you measure it with less bias, with less noise here to be established? Next slide, please. So here I break down a bit what we see. And I think it's not really a heat map, but what you can see is in terms of methods, we see a lot of protein biomarker, imaging, and functional biomarker. And looking at the context of use, what we can see here is the enrichment and the endpoints are highly in the numbers. And this is no surprise. Thinking about maybe 10, 20 years ago, we started really seeing genomic biomarker or biomarker in most cancer trials, and now they're almost in every trial. And most of them, of course, looking at how can we define the patient population in the best way, i.e. enrichment, or how we can define or qualify new endpoints, surrogate endpoints, how we can speed up drug development, bringing the medicines quicker to the patients in need. Next slide, please. So here another stats. What we have here is per year, a breakdown, how many qualification opinions, QO in blue, or how many qualification advices, QA in red, we received. And as you can see, it kicked off really in 2011, but has been since then more or less stable. And what this tells us as well is that there's still quite a proportion which ends up in a qualification advice and not a qualification opinion. And I think there we like to see a bit more. We like to be more successes because, again, only the opinions are published on our website, are available to all the research community to take this further. Next slide, please. So in order to make more use of these qualification advices, which are confidential and are not published, as mentioned, we invented something like a letter of support, which is based on a qualification advice when a novel biomarker under evaluation cannot be qualified yet because there's no sufficient evidence yet to convince us. However, there's shown to be promising results based on the data we have. And the idea is really to encourage here data sharing and facilitate studies aimed to bring this further, to have the qualification opinion once on our website and being used worldwide. And it's not a big document, it's maybe 2 or 3 pages. It's a high-level summary of novel biomarker, context of use, what is the data set available, what is maybe further needed, and how can sponsors identify or collaborate with these developers further to bring this to the next stage. Next slide, please. So as mentioned earlier, so kind of a soft landing platform. This is specifically for small, medium-sized enterprises and for academia. We have an informal platform for very early interaction. It is multidisciplinary. It discusses methods, technologies, and substances. It is limited to innovative developments and covers scientific, legal, as well as regulatory issues. Because very, very often, the most important thing of developments are what are we, who is the respective regulatory authority who's responsible for us, and in the same breath, when we identify the authority, what is the evidence required? And then we can start our development program or amend it or see how much time and how much investment we need to bring this forward. So as this is a very early interaction tool, it is free of charge, brainstorming style with experts from all over the network, so from all over the different agencies. And the first step is really a low hurdle. So it's a 3-pager completed by you to send to us, and then we engage in first discussions. Next slide, please. So this is a slide I think I hijacked from Tony Humphreys as well. This really shows how important we see academia as well as one of the major milestones here in excellent research and providing collaboration between us. In the center should always be the patient, of course, but we need to work together, and this is the overlapping circles here, in order to achieve that. Next slide, please. So this is my last one, and here I like to have a vision a bit, what we need to do. So coming back to regulatory science, the evolution of this is really essential to enable patient access to innovative medicines, addressing unmet medical need. And we in Europe, we have a world-class life science ecosystem with a massive opportunity to provide leadership. And we do it very often. And what I personally see is seeing these early developments all the time, is that the ideas really are maybe made in Europe, but then other continents or regions take over because they simply maybe have the better investment or have the better tools to transform or translate this into something more tangible, into a product, if you wish. Sure. So there we can do better. And maybe with the collaboration, and the workshop today is an excellent opportunity here, I think, to bring this forward. Significant research funding and collaborative public partnerships pursuing ambitious strategic research agendas should continue to have a real impact in our medicines. And I think we heard this morning as well that the funding is highly increased. And if we can tap only a little bit into this, I understand 100 billion project in the next Horizon 2020 agenda, this would be fantastic. And we have the opportunity here. We just need to, I think, do it the right way. And here, EMA, but it should be really the European network, so we all work together. We offer opportunity here to gain acceptance of these new technologies, and this biomarker qualification or something similar is one of these examples, but there are more. And I really think, I mean, my main job is really to promote Europe here, to keep R&D here and to have a product development here. And I think we have the fantastic opportunity and should collaborate in this respect, driving regulatory science forward. And this is my last slide. I think the next one is just thank you very much again to Anthony Humphreys and Thorsten Vetter who helped me putting the slides together. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. Especially it shows how the regulatory system tries to prepare as good as possible and a call for further collaboration. You already said you're going to try and make good, but I think these presentations are so very helpful and so interesting that I think everybody will suffer a little bit more or a bit less break time. But I think it's a pity if we cannot devote sufficient time to very helpful topics. I don't see at the moment any questions in the chat. So I think we can go to the next speaker, and I think I can congratulate you for successfully completing your or defending your thesis last Friday. So on interface between the regulatory and the health technology assessment. Very interesting perspective and quite new during this workshop. So please over to you, Vreman.
Yeah, thank you, Sabine. I just finished my PhD last Friday, indeed. So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about regulatory-HTA interface. I work at Utrecht University and the Dutch HTA organization, the National Healthcare Institute, or better known as ZIN to most people. And I want to actually give a few examples of maybe successful collaboration between the regulators and the HTA organizations. And the four that I want to discuss today are based on the EMA-UNETA work plan of 2017 to 2021 and relate to evidence generation, evaluation criteria, and the processes as well as the content of the evaluations of both these stakeholders. And of course, there are many more examples that I will not discuss in these 8 to 10 minutes, but I think this gives a nice look into what the interface of these two stakeholders can look like. So starting right off, this interesting study just published this year about, the study is actually about post-licensing evidence generation, but I sort of hijacked the figure that these authors present to highlight that early in the development here in the pre-submission phase on the left, there are ample opportunities for manufacturers to get joint scientific advice called parallel consultation between the EMA and national HTA organizations through UNETA. And this goes on throughout the drug life cycle, where you can start early and then in the decision-making phase, and after the decision-making phase regarding approval and reimbursement, there's still opportunity to get advice about the evidence to be generated. So this is a nice example of a successful implementation of a collaboration between the two stakeholders. So if you talk about evidence generation, then later on you go into the evaluation phase, where the criteria for evaluation are important. And one of the aspects that was highlighted in the EMA-UNETA work plan was the criteria for unmet medical need and how it is thought of by different stakeholders. And we looked into that in this study, where we first performed a review looking at what kind of elements are part of unmet medical need definitions. And we found these three: alternative treatments, disease severity, and patient population. And in the different definitions that we found them being measured in several different ways. And I think one outcome of this study was that stakeholders, we also discussed this within a multi-stakeholder consortium, including payers, manufacturers, patients, as well as the regulators and HTA organizations. And one of the findings was that people could agree to these elements, but that the operationalization of the elements within the regulatory frameworks or the value frameworks that applied nationally or European-wide really differed still between the stakeholders. So it also showed maybe the topics that weren't as aligned as you might want. Then going to the evaluations, we also see alignment on the processes of these different stakeholders. So I put here a very basic example that in the classic sense, you have this regulatory approval process going up until, on a European level, up until the European Commission confirmation of the approval. And then the HTA evaluation process starts and finishes several months or a lot of months later. And now we see that these stakeholders are collaborating, and we have this pilot in the Netherlands as well, where they collaborate more and share information, and it gives the opportunity for HTA organizations to finish their assessments way earlier, sometimes at the same time of the approval of the marketing authorization or shortly after. So I think this is a really nice implementation of process alignment of the two stakeholders. And then besides the processes, I also wanted to shortly talk about the content of the evaluations. In the talks between Ehmann and Junetta, it was hypothesized basically that the evaluation of significant benefits that is performed by the Committee for Orphan Medicinal Products from the Ehmann, that it was actually, that it could be quite similar to the relative effectiveness assessments of HTA organizations, because significant benefit is also established against a comparator. And we studied that in this study published in Drug Discovery Today this year. And we found that of the 23 products that we looked at, actually for 11 of them, the evaluations were actually almost the same. And for the other 12 shown on this slide, we found for 10 of the 12 differences in only one of the domains that we studied. So the 5 domains are listed on the left: the outcome measures, comparator, intervention, the patient population, and the used evidence. So the study shows two things basically. It shows that for a lot of drugs, actually, there is great potential for collaboration because the content of the evaluations are actually quite similar. And it also shows that on some cases, there were still differences, and the difference also relate to, back again, to the processes of the stakeholders and the differences in the scope and the remit. Because the significant benefit assessment is used for a decision on the orphan drug designation, while relative effectiveness is part of the HTA process. So the outcomes of the evaluations have very different purposes. So that was a very quick run through 4 examples of initiatives highlighting the interface of regulation and HTA. There are many more, of course. Part of the EMA-UNET work plan, but also outside of it. And I think what we've seen, what I've experienced, is that key success factors to this interface is that is the continuous and early involvement of the other stakeholders in the drug life cycle, the HTA organizations. That there is an open dialogue between all stakeholders, and there is information sharing as much as possible, that the dialogues are supported by scientific insights and good academic research. And also, I think this is very important, that there's mutual understanding of the scope and the remit of the different stakeholders, and there's respect that even though the scopes may differ, you can still work together. And I think we have to keep in mind that we work together all to sort of create an efficient and coordinated drug life cycle, or maybe I should say streamlined drug life cycle to benefit patient access. So I think that's it for me. If you have any questions, you can also email me.
Thank you very much, Rick, for a very interesting presentation, because I think we can do all we want to do. If there is no reimbursement, then it is difficult for the patients to benefit from the treatment. So very important work there, and good to see that colleagues are already trying to address that during the registration period. So thank you so much for that, and there will for sure be questions later on. I would like to propose to go to the next speaker, which is Tobias Polak, and he will take us through real-world evidence and artificial intelligence. Thank you very much for that.
Yes, thank you very much for the introduction. So my name is Tobias Polak, and I'm today on a slightly different topic than real-world data and artificial intelligence. Just one letter, but I'm going to talk about real-world data and expanded access, actually. So EA instead of AI. So my name is Tobias Polak. I have a background in econometrics, and I'm currently a part-time PhD student in biostatistics and HTA. And next to that, I also work at MyTomorrows, where I oversee the data collection. And I think it's important to see, of course, my presentation in that light. We at MyTomorrows are part of a research consortium together with the Erasmus Medical Center, sponsored by Health Hub. So that's also good in light of the collaborative ideas of today. And MyTomorrows provides services in expanded access and real-world data. And I'm going to first talk a bit on what expanded access is, then about what real-world data are, then a bit on our research on the intersection of both, and finally look at some practical considerations from a regulatory point of view. And of course, time for questions, but I'll think about the time too. So what is expanded access? Well, expanded access is basically a pathway to access investigational medicine outside of a trial. So formally, this is non-trial access to it also goes by the names of compassionate use, early access, managed access, ATUs in France. There are a lot of names for basically the same. Programs are intended for patients who currently have no approved treatment option available, that aren't eligible for clinical trials, that are suffering from debilitating or life-threatening disease, and it may benefit or may have a positive benefit-risk ratio for using investigational therapy. So that's short on expanded access. And what then is real-world data? Well, real-world data are, of course, the data collected outside of conventional clinical trials. And sources of those data may be electronic health records, patient registries, some even attempt to analyze whether patients tweet about adverse events on Twitter. But we want to look at expanded access basically as a source of real-world data. Why? Well, expanded access is treatment provided outside of a trial, and real-world data are data only to us, because otherwise I would only be preaching to my own choir. But there are actually quite some, this is just a recent snapshot of PubMed publications on people using the data from programs. Of course, a PubMed publication is one thing, but obtaining regulatory approval is a whole different ballgame. And that's actually what we want to investigate. So can you use the data from these programs, these real-world data basically, in your regulatory decision-making? And to answer that question, we first wanted to look at, okay, have regulators already been using data from these programs? So our main research focused on the displays in regulatory decision-making, and we set out to identify, characterize, and compare all the FDA and EMA approvals that form their clinical efficacy profile. To answer this question, though, we had to look at all the approval documentation that ever was available. So at the time, there were more than 22,000 documents available from the drug approvals from the EMA and the FDA website. So what we did, we basically downloaded all those documents and then did control find on the text for terms like compassionate use or special access or managed access. And then whenever such a term popped up, we investigated the document manually. So we looked at, okay, out of those 22,000 documents, how many actually used expanded access? And then we looked at the context. So was this expanded access named study or as a supportive study? There's one slightly unfortunate element, as you see on the right-hand side. It says readable text, yes or no. So there is a mythical love of wet ink signatures and paper documents and the use of scans, especially at the FDA, which for an ignorant millennial as I am, came a bit as a surprise. But those, of course, are pictures of text and not actually text that you can do control find. So we first have to get from the image to a text and then subsequently look at the text. So what did we find? We found I think 49 in total approvals that relied on this real-world data from expanded access programs. And although there is a clear increase in trend, which seems to be at the same pace as for the regulators for real-world data, surprisingly, back in the 90s, those expanded access programs were actually already used to collect some data and to support the approval in some way. At the time, they weren't called they were called observational studies or expanded access studies, which is, of course, far less fancy nomenclature than real-world data, but perhaps equally effective. So this was the research part. I now want also to look at, because it's a regulatory conference, of course, to look at who regulates this and how you run such a program in practice. So expanded access in Europe, at least, is regulated in principle by individual member states. So they oversee whether they grant such a request, but they also decide whether or not you actually can collect data within such a program. So some countries do allow that, and other, at least, say they do not allow it. There is an overarching compassionate use procedure for group programs, but to be fair, that only offers an advice and doesn't hold any authority over the individual member states. The fact that there's no harmonization here also lies to some inconsistencies sometimes. For example, I took this from the Belgium FAQ, and I don't want to bash at all Belgium regulators, so don't get me wrong here, but I just want to look at some inconsistencies. So they, for example, state that within such an unmet medical need program, no other data except pharmacovigilance can be gathered. But then if you do a quick PubMed search, well, there you find results of a expanded access program. So either they're violating the regulations, or it seems that the Belgian regulators were a bit too harsh in their statements. They looked at more than only pharmacovigilance here. They talked about safety and efficacy. So what we did, we asked regulators, how does your country view the expanded access program? And then they said, well, the EMA does not allow data collection on efficacy. And that would be very paradoxical, because when the EMA apparently uses that data in their decision making, but they would guide individual member states not to allow that data collection. And this is, I think, because in the guidelines on data collection, the EMA only talks about safety data collection that may be collected during such a program, but they mention nothing on efficacy. And I think this is wrong for three reasons. First of all, whenever you're treating patients with investigational, certain ethical imperative, other scholars have argued this, to collect some data on these patients. Second, they have been using these in the past, so that will be paradoxical to what they're doing. And third, if you are but that's a company point of view, if you are a company and you only can report safety or pharmacovigilance data from an expanded access program, it doesn't really become attractive to grant patients compassionate use of your product. So some final thoughts I wanted to end with. What we looked at, expanded access programs can indeed generate real-world evidence. And although we're all talking about real data and real-world evidence now, people were actually doing that already in the 1990s. I think there's some room for European harmonization, as I just showed you. And I think if we consider our observations in a greater context, it appears that conventional lines between what we think is purely treatment, expanded access, and what is research, say conventional clinical trials, are becoming increasingly blurred. And when people are using data that were not with the purpose of doing research, are suddenly used to draw inference upon, that makes it increasingly hard to distinguish what is treatment and what is research. And perhaps such a dichotomization is not natural to make, and for the future we might consider not making that distinction in such a rigid way. That was it. If you have any questions on MyTomorrows or our research or the Erasmus MC, yeah, let me know via the chat or any other channel.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasant surprise to have a kind of a bit of a different topic than originally thought, but very interesting, and very interesting also to highlight some of the contrasts in the information available. I think we have a little bit time for one question. There's a question: how have you established a validated algorithm to collect your information? And how did you validate this system?
So for the algorithm, in terms of what we designed in our research, or what we did to extract the image from the text?
You may answer it like you prefer, because it's a bit difficult to interact.
No, so sorry. So no, we didn't validate the algorithm to get from text to from image to a text. And we also didn't validate the control find function in a PDF, of course. But yeah, So the answer is short is no. But of course, this wasn't an algorithm that was designed to collect data on patient outcomes or something, or that should be 21 CFR Part 11 compliant or Annex 11 in which way you want to do as validation. This was just academical research, of course. And as I tried to convey, there's a different level of expertise or evidence associated with that.
Thank you very much. And I'm
Of course,
sure
I tried the evidence. Yeah.
Sorry. Thank you very much. And I'm sure we will have some time later on to further discuss this. Thank you very much. Very interesting presentation. And that brings me to the last presentation in this part of the program. And that's on ATMPs. And Delphi Coppens will take us through that. So please, over to you, Delphi.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. I hope that you can, I am in presentation mode now. Please tell me if that's not the case.
You're in the general presentation mode where we see all of the timings and everything. You're not in external presentation, but it's okay. I mean, it'll work.
I will see if I can amend that now. This should be better.
That's it. That's great. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So good afternoon, everyone. Today we'll be talking about regulating ATMPs as medicinal products. This was the title of my PhD that I conducted at Utrecht University. So I'll take you through the research that I did in that PhD. So I should add as a little disclaimer that what I'm about to tell you do not reflect the formal positions of the Dutch Cancer Society. So what are advanced therapy medicinal products? We already heard quite a few things about it this afternoon, but here you can see something as you could sort of label as the evolution of medicinal products. So after small molecules, we have the emergence of biologics, and now gene and cell-based therapies are reaching the clinic, which are called advanced therapy medicinal products in the European Union. But what is maybe creating issues in this field is that the regulatory systems co-evolved with the emergence of small molecules and to some extent, of course, the biologics. But now we have these innovative therapies like CAR-T therapies reaching the clinic. So that means that regulators have been under pressure for regulatory change. And during my PhD, I found two strategies for regulatory change. The first one is to stretch existing boundaries, so regulations that are aimed at marketing authorization for the commercial development and the market entry of new ATMPs as medicinal products. But there are also new regulations, and those regulations exempt in ATMPs from marketing authorization pathways. And these are aimed to facilitate treatment in clinical practice. So now I'll first zoom in on the first strategy for regulatory change, which is which was implemented through the ATMP regulation in the European Union, which I'm assuming most of you are familiar with. And here I just highlighted some of the changes that were implemented with the implementation of the ATMP regulation, which was the establishment of the Committee for Advanced Therapies. The Directive 2001, which is the overarching directive for medicinal products, was amended to include high-level requirements for ATMP authorization and guidelines, although those guidelines are still not very detailed, so there is still a lot of room for standardization, as was already discussed earlier on. There is a risk-based approach in the ATMP regulation, which sort of enables to deviate a little bit from the rigid and the stringent requirements of the Directive 2001 to determine on which scientific evidence you can build your dossier for authorization, and that should be based on scientific rationale. The hospital exemption was enacted, which I will explain in a bit, and it includes incentives to stimulate commercial development. And this table shows you the decision making for authorization in 3 jurisdictions. The table is way too complicated to explain in detail now, so I'm just going to highlight a few aspects from this table. What was very evident in the assessment for benefit risk for these products in all jurisdictions actually was that there was a lot of uncertainty on the study design. So only the black squares were evaluated as a satisfactory study design. So all of these uncertainties created problems to evaluate clinical outcomes for these products. Nevertheless, all of these products were in the end approved. What was very clear is that both in the EU and in Japan, but let's focus on the EU, a lot of post-marketing study obligations were imposed on the developers to continue to collect safety and efficacy data. And what is very typical for this field is that even for authorized ATMPs, post-marketing obligations were imposed to still optimize product quality. And this is an area with a lot of challenges in this field. But the model of licensing of ATMPs resembles the model of adaptive licensing or a life cycle approach, where you grant early approval and you continue to collect evidence during the post-marketing phase. And that, of course, suits promising new technologies that have very good clinical outcomes but have unknown long-term effects. And here is the second strategy for change, the hospital exemption. And this figure shows how the hospital exemption is positioned in relation to the other regulatory the regulatory pathways. So with the enactment of the ATMP regulation, now more therapies were considered a medicinal product. And was feared that some of these products could not adhere to the stringent requirements of medicinal product regulation. So this was one of the rationales to enact the hospital exemption. And the hospital exemption, there were some basic provisions in the ATMP regulation, but those then needed to be translated into national provisions by each member state. But the basic provisions in the ATMP regulation mostly resemble named patient use pathways, and is really focused on manufacturing and GMP compliance. However, when we looked at the national provisions for the hospital exemption, it became evident that there has been a diversification of provisions for the hospital exemption across the EU, because regulators or the responsible competent authorities chose to implement additional provisions on top of those basic provisions that were provided in the ATMP regulation. And it does not really help for the transparency or the harmonization across the European Union. And we also sent out a survey to see how the hospital exemption was then actually used in these member states. And what we found is that it was actually used in a quite moderate way, but we did only studied it until the end of 2017, I should add. But since the enactment of the hospital exemption in some member states in 2009, only 12 ATMPs have been manufactured under the hospital exemption. Although it is very likely that in France there has been more production, but we were unable to reach these facilities. But for the other facilities, it is quite complete, except that also in Germany, also private facilities can manufacture under the hospital exemption, and we saw that here a few ATMPs had been manufactured on quite a relatively large scale. So now how to move forward in this field. Here I just want to highlight again some of the characteristics of this field. So most of the clinical trials conducted in the European Union are sponsored by non-profit sponsors, so mostly academic hospitals. And most of the clinical trials are still in early phase, early clinical development. So it is quite a young field. So it's very important that clinical developments are optimized by improving transfer from a pre-competitive to a competitive environment. That's very important for translational research. Early scientific advice to prevent market rejection later on in the process. Enhanced knowledge dissemination to build a very strong collective knowledge base. And public and private engagements to bring commercially viable ATMPs to the market. EU-wide public registries can also really help to provide insights in which ATMPs are available in the European Union, both in clinical trials and the hospital exemptions. There's not a lot of transparency at the moment. And those registries could also facilitate a continuous long-term surveillance and data collection for these ATMPs, including for the ATMPs manufactured under the hospital exemption. And with that enhanced transparency, you could also use the manufacturing, the authorization and the hospital exemption pathways in a more complementary fashion, so that you keep the systems sort of separate and that you keep the authorization pathway for commercially viable ATMPs and those that are that have a closer proximity to clinical practice stay within the hospital exemption and academic hospitals. And if it's necessary to transfer one of these products to another pathway, that it is possible and also transparent. It may be that there are also ATMPs that probably don't fit in both systems. And it was also highlighted earlier, for example, for personalized medicine, it's possible that a new sort of regulatory structure or how to embed these ATMPs in these regulatory structures is necessary. And that is something that we are currently evaluating at the Dutch Cancer Society. So what I discussed until now is everything up until marketing authorization, but there are also more downstream hurdles for these ATMPs, mainly distribution and scaling up issues. And also reimbursement will be one of the main challenges in this field. So to conclude, I've shown you that there is a shift towards early market access and enhanced post-marketing surveillance, and new exemption pathways have been implemented. So there has been regulatory change, but it is very critical for this field to have more centralized knowledge dissemination and collaborative efforts that could catalyze the availability and benefit patients on the regional and global level. That will require multi-stakeholder engagement. And I don't think it will be an easy task, but I don't think it is impossible to continue to connecting the dots and to form a very strong network between all these stakeholders. So that is my final takeaway for this presentation. And I'd be happy to take some questions.
Thank you very much, Delphi, on a very interesting presentation on promising drugs and medicines and how best to follow them up, and the challenges that are there to make them available for the public and the challenges to monitor those. I think we are very stretched for time at the moment. For the program, we would like to have a small little comfort break and restart in 5 minutes. There are very interesting questions in the chat, and hopefully colleagues can remember them and ask them during the discussion. So I think, Dwayne, we will have a short comfort break until 15 minutes before 5 o'clock. Is that correct?
That sounds fine. We'll stop for till quarter till, and we'll see everyone back here.
We have had a very interesting afternoon so far. And now we are for the last part, the discussion session. We have 5 very knowledgeable panel members, and that will certainly help in organizing the discussion. And I will just name them briefly: Peter Mol, Ivana Silva, Larissa Delanoy, Ayma Turki, and Joop van Gerven. And as you can see, if you know them, they are a very good representation of all the different stakeholders. Every panelist will get 2-3 minutes to give a very brief reflection or statement from their perspective on the presentations and the slides. And then there will be a discussion based on the questions raised from the audience. And like it was highlighted, you can vote for questions, if I'm correct. So certain questions will move up and will be addressed with more urgency than others, or more priority. And without further ado, I would like to hand over to the first panelist, and Peter Mol. If you could take the floor, that would be great.
Thank you, Sabine. Thank you for the organizers for a fantastic afternoon. I've heard lots of interesting stuff, and I will reflect a little bit from the perspective of both a researcher in drug regulatory science, but also especially someone who is in applied regulatory science in the Scientific Advice Working Party of the EMA. And I would like to say that that triangle of Tony Humphreys is really important. We have on the top all the decisions that have to be made on products, and at the bottom there's this regulatory science feeding into the development and the new ways of getting evidence there. What I think I would like to focus on in my reflection is that what I heard this afternoon, it's also so important that there will be an exchange of this knowledge, that this regulatory science flows into the general decision making. And it's not only things like disclosing our knowledge as a regulator to the public, like on the one pages on public health or on drug information, as Marjon described, but it is especially also the interaction, as I said, between drug developers and regulators, and then with an emphasis in a project like STARS that Marjon described on the exchange of information between development of products at an academic level, where I think also Delphi Coppens talks of ATMPs that are so difficult to catch in the regulatory framework. And I think there was also discussion on, does it fit with, or does it move along with new developments, this regulatory framework? But it also goes into the collaboration between regulators and industry and other academic partners in public-private partnerships, as in IMI or Horizon programs, where it is so important in my mind that regulators and the different partners come together to discuss new developments. It is not easy though, and I wanted to bring that reflection in, and we haven't talked so much about that, is the aspect of the conflicts of interest. There is a lot of difficult looking from different parties, not so much perhaps today around the table, but also external parties like the Ombudsman and sometimes also the media that really are critical on the role of the regulator protecting public health. And if they participate in these types of programs, how do you safeguard this independent position? And I would argue that it is vital that platforms like RSNN and public-private partnerships are taking place in full transparency, what is being done, that these regulators do know what is happening, that they hear from Tobias, Polak on what you can learn from perhaps expanded access programs by groups that are sometimes seen as pressure groups of bringing medicines perhaps too early to the market. But I think also the COVID crisis teaches us that it is so important to align, to learn what the evidence is. And sometimes the evidence is not that good. Hydroxychloroquine wasn't a good example of this learning from real world data. So I think that this interaction, the platform of RSNN and the discussion we're having today is really feeding into me a new kind of regulatory readiness level. I think was framed by Paul Korte, where I hope meetings like this will contribute to. But it is not straightforward, and I would like to hear perhaps from the public or from the participants around the table what they feel of safeguarding that regulators still look at the data very carefully with a preconceived idea what is going to be shown, and that they are independent when making their assessments. Thank you, Sabine. The floor is giving it back to you.
Thank you, Peter. Two important points, the regulatory framework, collaboration and transparency that will help in the discussion, I think. Ivana, maybe you could provide a perspective from your point of view.
Thank you very much, Sabine, and good afternoon, everyone. Indeed, I think we are listening very much about the value of collaboration today. And I've been working in the past 10 years in public and stakeholder engagement. And the focus of my points would be very much in the field of patient and healthcare professional engagement. And we've heard that, for example, Paul was mentioning that we really need to look at the whole ecosystem. And I think we really need to look at the wider stakeholders community. So of course, the focus today has been very much academia, developers, regulators, but we should not forget patients and healthcare professionals. And indeed, Liana has presented a very concrete example of how PRAC has engaged and is engaging with patients and healthcare professionals, and how this is then leading to more concrete and better use of medicines in clinical practice, and how this leads to minimizing risk. And I think that this is truly necessary if we are indeed focusing on public health driven research leading to regulatory innovation. And this has to be both of a high standard, but also connected with reality. And therefore that reality is brought forward by involving patients and healthcare professionals. I think we've heard also from Jarno that there is an important diversity that needs to be built into networks, and that this also needs to bring making sense of innovations. And again, I think this links very much with this aspect of bringing patients and healthcare professionals. And also what was argued by Tobias in terms of looking at this continuum from research to innovation in therapeutic strategy. So it's not one or the other, it's the whole continuum. And again, bringing patients and healthcare professionals into the discussions and into the networks is absolutely essential. And one should not underestimate the fact that by doing so, their own networks and their own communities can support research in terms of recruiting participants in research, in translating and interpreting information in a language which is absolutely necessary for their audiences, and then supporting researchers, regulators, developers in disseminating and cascading the outcomes of the research, and which at the end of the day will provide more acceptability to the research that is being done, and also to the decision making that will come from that research in innovative regulation. So I think I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ivana, for also highlighting very specifically the role of the patients and the healthcare professionals in the whole system, and the continuum of the innovation, the research, and the regulation. Thank you. On my list is the next one, is Larissa Delanoy. Please, over to you.
Thank you. Can you hear me well?
Excellent.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, thank you, and especially thanks for the nice plea, Silva, Ivana, for the patient. I'm talking as a patient representative. And first, let me start by thanking the RSNN team for making it possible that the patient representation is part of the discussion panel, because I think that is really a huge deal. I have been part of several regulatory science and healthcare and scientific initiatives, and I must say EMA has a great patient engagement framework, and the RSNN initiatives are extremely relevant to be part of as a patient representative. So I cannot stress enough that better decisions will be taken and patient value will increase if patients are part of the process and have a significant voice. And I personally come from the field of rare disease, and generally speaking, there's a huge unmet need in that field. So all of this work actually contributes usually to pave the way for new and innovative treatments. But not only that, I also think it paves the way for new ways of collecting data and be smart on how to use limited data and biomarker data and real world data, which stood out for me to bring new treatments to market and make them accessible to patients. So I am happy to see that in many initiatives that we talked about today, the patient voice is heard and can bring value and have an impact. This benefits decision making and prioritization to increase the value to patients. Actually, I'm especially interested in the way that prioritization to the budget in the EMA discussions that Tony Humphreys presented is actually done. How is the patient's voice heard in that process? 3 other things that stood out for me in the context of regulatory science is I really like the idea of the regulatory readiness that was put forward by Korte. And I'm also particularly keen on getting the pacing problem solved, as referred to by Jarno Hoekman. Last but not least, in relation to Rick Vreman's work on the connection of regulatory process with the HTA process, that is really of the ultimate essence to patients. Speeding up the pace and to work on the regulatory readiness and properly linking and leveraging regulatory HTA processes require courage and a real sense of urgency. So, well, to conclude with something that is quoted so many times, the patients are waiting.
Thank you very much for a very clear and helpful perspective from the patient. Thank you. So regulatory readiness, patients would like to have their problem solved, and we also need to involve the HTA in order to ensure that medicines are available and affordable. Thank you very much for that. Very helpful. Ahmad Turki, please over to you, Ahmad.
Thanks, Sabine. Hi, good afternoon, and thank you for the invite. Great conference so far. So my name is Ahmad Turki. I work for MSD and responsible for regulatory science policy in the EMEA region. So also from my reflection, as I was taking notes during this very rich workshop, I ended actually with 3 questions during the coffee break that really resonated with me in relation to my day-to-day work. And basically, these questions are, how do we define and maximize this value? And I think that's a key theme of this conference today. And how do we bridge between the evidence generations and policymaking? And certainly also, what are the trends in the next years that will emphasize that need for collaborative research? So if we think about that, how we define and maximize value, I think all these actors, as we also have on the panels, cannot really operate in a vacuum. So I think next to our legal and regulatory framework we operate in, we also have some sort of social contract with society, as they say. And I really like the comments made by Peter around the trust and transparency, as these are critical as we move forward. So I think next to these regulatory and technical topics we have discussed, it will be important to show and to communicate that value to society, and the science behind the decision making, take into account the core foundation of science, which is uncertainty at the end of the day. And I think with the current COVID-19 discussions, I think that's quite a relevant and topical discussion. On the second reflection, the question I had relates to the evidence, more evidence-based policy making, perhaps. So it's not like evidence-based medicines. So how do we bridge between evidence and policy? And for this, we really need to look beyond perhaps the number of products approved or the number of publications, but really have a discussion how we fully utilize the generated evidence. And I think Paul mentioned that also in his presentations from the public-private partnerships and academia. And how can we effectively, within the policy process, also prepare the regulatory framework of the future? And I think also Marjon really made very great presentations with regard to the work they're doing. But I think at the end, listening to the discussions, I think the biggest challenge is the delay from action to impact. So evidence-based medicines is perhaps easier to establish feedback loops for the time frame we have, but looking at the policy world, there may be a lot of time and intervening variables which make it difficult to feedback to be recognized and applied in the system, which really connects again to the pacing problem as presented by Jarno. And I think also looking forward, the discussion of the pharmaceutical strategy from the European Commission, that be very, very important as that moves forward, because it will not be only the evidence-driven discussion, but also a lot of other topics will be depending on that. And last but not least, I think also the need for a strong pipeline of qualified graduates who will take their place in regulatory bodies and within companies like Evans, who are trained to be actually bilingual in both science and policy and understand the dilemmas of drug development. And the last question is more about the trends. And I think we can all agree that the regulatory system should be able to react fast as new science informs us of inefficiencies or inadequacies in the current process of framework. But I think we also should strive to establish a learning system. And it's not only for the EU, but I think also looking from a company like MSD, we are very looking also to set an example for emerging regions to support their mission to further strengthen their systems. So perhaps conclude, Sabine, not to take too much time. So I think we have shared ambitions. Future state of the framework will not be achieved overnight. And I think we really need to consider very carefully how to utilize the evidence and at the same time to be flexible and agile, as I think all of this work is happening while the plane is still in the air, as they say. So looking forward to the remaining discussions, Sabine.
Thank you very much. Very helpful and interesting questions, and building the bridge as we walk, actually, I think. So thank you very much, Ahmad, for those reflections. And then last but not least, I would like to turn over to Joop van Gerwen for his point of view. So please, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sabine. As a last in line, of course, much, if not most, has already been said. As a trial regulator, chair of the Dutch Competent Trial Authority and Central Ethics Committee, I would strongly like to echo the appeal for patient involvement. This is important for all the reasons that have been said, but we should also take into consideration that we will have to teach patients to be involved in to be treated with much more uncertain drugs in the future. Many of the drugs that we are going to develop will not be able to present all the evidence that we have been become accustomed to. And so patients will inevitably, I believe, in many cases, always be subjects in trials to some extent. And so we will have to learn from what patients have to tell us, and this requires adaptations of the healthcare system. It has to be developed into a learning healthcare system in order to accommodate all the different types of drugs that we see coming out of the pipelines. And this also requires a different attitude and perhaps different competencies of healthcare professionals. They will have to be able to adapt to these uncertainties, which in many ways are inherent to the variability of patients and their diversity in conditions. So what I would like to highlight, and it has been briefly mentioned, but I think it's very important to the extent that it should perhaps be a topic for one of the future meetings of this important organization, and that is the topic of education. How are we going to train our doctors, our healthcare professionals, our basic scientists to develop drugs for the future, to treat patients with these compounds in a way that we keep learning from them, to deal with all the possibilities and uncertainties. And I think this calls for a new academic movement of drug development and regulatory science. And that will also perhaps help us to step out of the different platforms which we currently try to network. We should become more part of one academic and scientific community than trying to network parties from different areas of scientific and professional expertise. So that's what I would like to bring into the discussion. And again, congratulations for this very useful and informative meeting. And I think it attests to the fact that these are very important steps in the future. Thanks very much, Sabine.
Thank you very much, Joop. Very interesting. You bring to the table something different on education. I think that's very important, and education for all the stakeholders, I guess. And also, I like the fact that you brought in the uncertainties, because that's also something that we need to learn with, to work with, and something we need to accept or not, but we need to be aware of that. So thank you very much for those reflections, very helpful. I saw in the chat that the most upvoted question to start with is a question to Paul on the trials at home. Is there a digital platform being considered? So I hope that Paul is still available and can answer that question. And then we can move forward to the next most voted question.
Paul, can you unmute if you're with us? I'm afraid Elvis has left the building. Sabine, we may want to move to another question.
Okay, we still have his nice picture, but he's muted, so maybe we can come back to that later. That's a pity for the most upvoted question. Another very important question is that the EU is a patchwork of many very different social security systems coming from very different East-West backgrounds. It will be close to impossible to melt them together in one system in the near future. It's not a question, it's more, I think, a statement. But would colleagues want to reflect on that? I think maybe Rick might be the best placed or the best informed one, Rick Vreman.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I can maybe comment on that for a bit. So I guess it also depends on what you call the near future, probably. But I agree that there are still a lot of differences in the social systems within Europe, but I do think that many of the different things that are happening in each European country are quite similar already, and still offer some potential for further streamlining and coordination. So I guess even if we don't have one system within the near future, we can still cooperate and coordinate between the different systems to make the whole a bit more efficient.
Thank you, Rick. That's very helpful. I don't know if Tony, if you would like to come in from the European Medicines Agency perspective, or would you like to pass here?
Well, no, I can say, I mean, it's, I mean, to be honest with you, 25 years ago when the agency was put in place, somebody said that you couldn't take an antibiotic through the centralized procedure because of national divergence in medical practice, and that was shown not to be the case. And there was other therapeutic areas that due to sort of national tradition, whatever, it wasn't possible to have the sort of convergent or a majority sort of European position. So I think experience over time has shown that's essentially not the case. I think where we're at the moment, even with the HTA type regulation, that's the next phase along the chain. And people say there's no reason why you can't have an objective discussion on the health technology assessment of any technology coming through, be it a medicinal product or a device or whatever. And I think people broadly recognize that. In terms of placing a value on that with regards to an economic value, honestly, I think that sort of fragmentation either across the member states or within member states, even with regional systems, that's likely to be always the case. That'll have to be customized. So it's I don't think we're any different to, if you go over to the States, FDA, although FDA can issue a central approval with all the various sort of insurance type corporations involved, you do not get a unique answer or a unique assessment as to that value proposition. But I do think with regards to, discussing global clinical development of a medicinal product and exposing, both animals and patients to that development, there's a sort of societal obligation that we have to come together to make sure that that development is optimized to generate the right information, both for us as risk-benefit decision makers, but also the downstream decision makers. That includes the HTA colleagues and then ultimately the payers. Because if as we all say, patient is at the center of all our efforts, if the product isn't in the hand of the patient, or at least in the healthcare professional for prescribing to the patient, then we globally have failed. So I still think that's there is no magic solution around the corner that's going to give us a sort of unique social system for Europe anytime soon. But in terms of that value discussion on products and the evidence that you generate to demonstrate that value, and the place of things like real world evidence to support those value projections, I think it's a really productive area for us in the future. Over.
Thank you very much, Tony. I don't know if Larissa, from the patient perspective, you also highlight the importance of making products available also on the economical point. Would you like to add something?
Yeah, I'm not sure what to add to this, but yeah, for it's more broadly speaking, of course. No, I'm not sure.
No, thank you. Sorry for putting you on the spot. I think you already highlighted the tremendous importance of making products also financially available and affordable for patients.
The affordability is an important issue, and the overall process is important for connecting the regulatory process to the HTA process, for sure. So yeah, the differences between countries plays an important role in that, and I think also the differences perhaps in the language between the several between HTA people that work on HTA processes and regulatory processes are I think there is a difference between them as well that might be overcome in hopefully the future to benefit that that process. So
yeah, very helpful and clear. Thank you very much for that. Sorry.
If time you want to proceed, or can I just say something
Please.
About this? Well, I think the elephant in the room here is perhaps efficacy. I mean, I'm a neurologist. For every 10 patients I treat, there's one who will benefit on average. So there's lots of waste of drugs. I'm not a pharmacoeconomist, so perhaps Rick can fill us in here. But what if we would be able to identify the patients who actually benefit from the treatment and stop treating the rest? And wouldn't that really solve much of the cost issues to start with? Is there any idea, Rick, on how much that would mean? If you can say something general about this.
Yeah, no, I don't have an estimate on what the potential savings are of this approach, but I do agree that the potential for saving is quite significant. Yeah, and maybe if I also may now that I have the word, may I also briefly comment on the reflections before? I think there's also a question about the potential harmonization still in the chat, and I think of course harmonization through UNETA is I think an important step on aligning HTA processes throughout Europe, but there are examples of collaboration that goes beyond the relative effectiveness into the pricing negotiation and procurement of medicines. For example, the Benelux initiative, where 5 countries work together to coordinate the total process of HTA and pricing and reimbursement. So I think there is still an opportunity to align also on the value aspects of drugs and devices.
Yeah, or somebody in the chat, which of course mentioned the word personalized medicine in this regard. But personalized medicine has many different aspects which I don't think are usually recognized. It's not just about finding the right drug for the right target. It's also taking into consideration many other different factors, pharmacokinetics, use factors, etc., etc. So it's a broader problem than what is typically concerned to be personalized medicine. But it certainly is part of this discussion.
Thank you very much. I think it's a very important topic and something that I'm always very interested in the genetic aspects of certain treatments and whether or not we can select the right patient for the right treatment. But setting that aside for a minute, we also still have a very interesting topic carried over from the previous discussions that were in the chat, and that concerned a kind of discussion between Tony and Jarno. So if you are available, I can see you in the chat, so that's great. There was the question that Jarno highlighted the difference in pacing, so the difficulty for the regulators to keep up with the innovation and the research, and at the same time EMA is having this strategy meeting, and how do these two issues relate? So I think it might be best to start with Tony, and then maybe Jarno might also have some possible solutions for that.
Yeah, and thanks very much for that, Sabine. And I think one of the comments in the chat sort of said that I had said that EMA was on top of these innovations. I certainly wouldn't characterize ourselves as being on top of anything, frankly. Well, not on this discussion of identifying, new sort of science and technology that's hitting the system. It is a struggle to keep up with it, that's for sure, because I think, regulation follows science rather than the other way around. I think everyone's fairly comfortable with that. But the real question then is, and I very much like the language of these, what was it, the regulatory readiness sort of scale that was being proposed for any given sort of emerging science or technology with regards to its real application. So I think the sort of the common challenge we have is to somehow identify what these emerging technological applications are in due time, and to try to have a system whereby we can have a conversation about how do we prepare to receive that or accept that within any existing regulatory framework that technology might be challenging, and that can be a manufacturing technology, can be a clinical trial, evidence generation, whatever. So that's the challenge. What we've done in terms of to try to get ready, apart from having the sort of the RS sort of the debate, is to try to put in place what we call horizon scanning, and in that ambition we share it with HTA colleagues and indeed others in Europe. But that in itself is actually quite a challenge. It's a very mature area. A lot of sort of health ministries, etc., have had very mature horizon scanning type activities. I think we in the regulatory type environment, we're starting to invest in that, not just in Europe, but indeed internationally. It's a current topic under the ICMA umbrella. And then, okay, so once you detect something, let's take the artificial intelligence. I think one of the colleagues was describing it as the early phase of Jarno, the sort of, we're still in its fluid phase, as it were. What the hell do we mean by AI and its applications across our regulatory framework? And indeed it can be, and Sabine, we've heard applications by companies using AI with regards to, adverse event reporting, processing these hundreds of thousands, if not millions of reports from around the world, and trying to get a handle on what's the signal over noise ratio, and then how do we then deal with that with regards to onward labeling. But there can be many other applications of artificial intelligence that we as a regulatory system have to accommodate for. And I think it's a real challenge, because the fact of the matter is accommodating such innovation is a response to any regulatory region, but the regions that are most successful in accommodating those innovations are essentially going to be where the future will then take place, and you will get products developed in those regions that can successfully accommodate those innovations. And regions who are not able to accommodate those innovations will essentially fall further behind, and at best then will be a recipient of what is a pre-done, pre-cooked development program, and you'll be presented with a sort of a take it or leave it type scenario. Now, obviously, I would not wish to end up in that latter type situation, but unless we have a fairly open mind as a system and are able to engage with this challenge to try to keep pace with some of these innovations and challenges, yeah, there's always that risk. So we have to work hard in order to maintain Europe's position as a innovation-friendly type ecospace, I think. Over.
Thank you, Tony. And again, Europe needs to be, or should be, very research-minded. We heard that before several times. Jarno, would you like to come in and provide some solutions for regulatory colleagues to be on top of everything?
I'm not sure whether I'm the right person to ask for the solutions, but I can give some further reflections. And I do think to a large extent I do agree with what Tony was just saying. And for me, the pacing problem is a systemic problem. So it's not something you can easily kind of attribute to one organization, or where one organization would be able also to solve it. So, and I think that is a very important observation to make. And also it might be very natural in our current way of thinking about the ecosystem that indeed kind of regulation will always be following research and innovation, and that there is a lag time between what's happening in the two domains. So in that sense, there might, I mean, you can also kind of discuss how big this problem actually is. So my point for bringing it up was more in terms of that what we actually see in terms of activities is that the activities are directed towards trying to increase the pace and to kind of align regulation and innovation more clearly. And if we are doing so within the system, and that involves all types of stakeholders, then new questions emerge about what regulatory science is, how it is conducted, and also how we need to evaluate it. And I think that's and that's, I think, a task for us to take up as a regulatory science community. So so in that respect, I think our perspectives are not so far aligned from each other.
Thank you very much. Very helpful. And a lot of work to be done in the future. That's always good to look forward to. I think there was also a very interesting question also for researchers, and that was addressed to Falk regarding the biomarkers. And there was the question, why are there so few opinions, but many advices? Because it would be so very helpful for researchers to have a better view on what is being done. Do you have any idea, Falk, what might be an explanation for the fact that there are only very few opinions, but that there are many, many advices?
Thank you, Sabine. So I think it's a very good question, and the answer might be a multitude. So one thing is, of course, you can ask, what is the incentives of going through this process? So if a big company goes through the process, having a drug development with a certain biomarker, it will immediately help or incentivize its development, bringing a product to the market, which the financial gains. Now, if a research institution goes through this one, it is a very, very intense exercise to go through this process. It's not done in a month or so. It's normally, if not years, it's definitely several months, 6 months plus, and resource intense. So you can ask as well, indeed, what is the benefit for the respective person? It benefits society and research society in general, but again, such procedures needs to be maybe incentivized a bit more for academia. Now, what I just heard from the colleague, I think keeping pace, I think, is extremely important. But I think we need to look at keeping pace in both directions here. Because what I see very often is that very good ideas, publication in Nature or in a high-impact journal, are coming to us. And they think they're close to a validation, official validation by the regulator. And as we know, science, at least what I learned once, is duplicates every 5 years. Now, looking at where most of us went in university, maybe 25 years plus. So it's always an exponential growth in scientific knowledge. And in addition, the requirements grow as well. We want safer medicines, we want perfectly working medicines, and so on. So looking at what it takes now, medicine on the market compared to even 20 years ago when I started working in the regulatory arena is immense. And similar, of course, this keeping pace is, I think, that we as regulator need to educate as well the potential stakeholders. What are the requirements? So I think there's sometimes an underestimation of the requirements necessary for official validation, because once this is done, this can be used throughout any kind of clinical trials and should be accepted by the regulator. And we need to look for incentives, of course, to do so for research institutions which don't have the direct impact, direct benefit. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a very helpful answer. At least I hope that also the colleague who posed the question would be happy with that answer. There were other questions. One of them regarded the presentation from Liana, and that concerns the fact that there are so many generics available for valproate. So who actually owns the problem of the issue of the risks and how to minimize them? Is there a certain owner or somebody you can work with in view of the many generics that are available? So maybe you can provide some insights, Liana?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. It's a very relevant question indeed in the situations when there are several marketing authorization holders involved. In this specific case I have presented on valproate, we have seen a very good collaboration between different marketing authorization holders. So they formed a consortium, and by doing so, they shared all responsibilities, for instance, for conducting all the post-authorization safety studies that were imposed following finalization of the referral, and they have chosen the innovator company, Sanofi in this case, as a contact point for regulatory authorities. So that's how they solved the issue this time, by sharing all the responsibilities.
Thank you very much, Liana. And now we are on the topic of the valproate. I think, Ivana, you might want to highlight a little bit more on a public hearing, what we can get out of it, how we should organize it, when we should organize it, what the advantages and maybe the disadvantages might be. So over to you, please, Ivana.
Thank you very much, Sabine. I think we need to see public hearings in the wider context of tools available for engaging with patients and healthcare professionals and other stakeholders. Indeed, the public hearing has been, let's say, the last pillar of the pharmacovigilance legislation to be implemented, and it's very much a regulatory step to allow structured input from the public in a specific PRAC procedure where a safety concern is being assessed. And it's very much a moment where the committee, PRAC, will be on listening mode, where specific questions will be raised. But it's really a moment where patients, industry, healthcare professionals, academia, members of the public will bring their very concrete points, and this will inform the discussions within the PRAC. Together with other moments along the whole cycle of the process, where it is important to listen to patients and healthcare professionals. What the very positive impact is: one, it is about transparency. Two, it's about building trust in the fact that the whole regulatory process is indeed focusing on what is the impact of what is being done, and the decisions that will be taken through the regulatory process, which will have an impact in how the medicines will be used, what restrictions will be made, and that patients and health professionals are involved in that process. But as I said, this is part of a wider, if I could call it, menu of tools for engagement, and I think that's where we should see the whole process. what we've seen with valproate as the first public hearing, but we have had another one on quinolones, is that then it is possible through the discussions to identify additional points which might necessitate, after further discussion with PRAC, of other more specific stakeholder meetings, where the next steps on how exactly the measures will be implemented and how we bring on board those who will be then impacted by those decisions and will have to implement them on the clinical practice, to discuss with them more concrete aspects. So I think all in all, it's a very positive development. It has to be seen in the wider context of other tools, and it's not a solution alone, but it's certainly a moment for regulators to listen. And I think that proactive listening has been very welcomed by the public.
Thank you very much for highlighting all these interesting aspects. Yes, Larissa, you would like to come in. Please, over to you.
Yeah, I would like to add to the possibilities of the public hearing, or actually that's part of the process. With my personal experience being part of a stakeholder review where we were invited as a patient organization to reflect in the context of a reflection paper. And I must say, it is really perfectly organized by EMA. I really appreciate that I think the patient voice was heard for the several indications. And it gave us the opportunity to interact with EMA representatives and as well as academia representatives. So I think those processes work very well in the EMA context. Just wanted to highlight that.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful to know. It was a rather big happening because it was the first one, and it's good to know that it's been very well received. Very conscious of the time. I think we need to close, unfortunately.
Begin jullie maar alvast. Ik moet nog half een beetje luisteren. Maar ja, eigenlijk.
Sorry, Imad, maybe you can mute. Yeah, thank you. Well, at least we could. I don't know who I heard somebody, but I got information that we need to close. In the program, there is foreseen that Tony would give some responses or reflections on the discussions of the day. So please, over to you, Tony.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much. I certainly can't summarize everything that we've been sort of hearing about through the course of this really interesting day, but if I can maybe just go through a couple of highlights that I just want to. I mean, Marjon, I was very taken with the whole initiative on the internships and putting aside the byproduct of MEB sort of staffing issues, the fact that that is part of that education rollout and that a younger generation of scientists going into either the clinical trials area, the industry, the academia, that they at least have that exposure to the regulator and the real world regulator rather than the fantasy regulator. I think that's really great. I was also incredibly impressed by the research agenda and the fact that, with MEB's science policy that's coming up on the back of the next 4 to 5 year agenda, and what we have to do, because starting with the limited resources that's available in Europe to address to this whole sort of regulatory science, thinking of that pyramid that we started with at the beginning of the afternoon, we really have to think about sort of work sharing and having maybe a common agenda, but then obviously sharing out the work that's done and being very sort of transparent and communicating on the outputs from that. Because when you get, like, I absolutely love the case that she highlighted with regards to that one species reduction in terms of the preclinical, non-clinical testing based on an evidence-based, retrospective analysis. I mean, that's absolutely fantastic. And you really wonder, we absolutely need an awful lot more on that. And then moving on to Jarno, when he was talking about the pacing problem, and I was very much taken with the observation with Peter about, conflicts of interest, even criticism from the European Ombudsman about the whole scientific advice process and the sort of non-transparency that goes around that. I think there is a desire amongst us that we would actually take what at the moment, there's an awful lot of that sort of bilateral, confidential type of exchange, which is helpful in designing these trials, but in identifying those issues, those signals of those sort of areas that are actually most challenging, I think there is a shared commitment that we would somehow take that to a broader multi-stakeholder discussion on that would be more public in its nature. And again, I was struck by the appeal that, you know, the benefits of being transparency on building trust into the system and in sharing any learnings that's coming through some of these development challenges in a more transparent way. I really think over the next 5 years or so, we should actually endeavor to have more of these sort of, I think we're calling them future advisory platform type meetings or R&D platform meetings we're having in a couple of weeks' time, but certainly bringing a more open discussion on some of these challenges. Accepting that there can be elements of commercial confidentiality that have to be overcome. And I do think the declaration of interest can be and should be manageable. And then just with Paul then with regards to, I've already commented on the challenge of, do we have a regulatory readiness level in response to any emerging technology or evolution? I think that's a really great challenge to lay down and even to sort of think of the challenge in that sense. And what is our response to, because identifying something that's coming, yeah, okay, we have a problem with, I don't know, let's say registers or whatever, that's one thing, but putting in place workshops that you do a priori to any individual product decision and making sure that, you know, the infrastructure to collect that evidence post-authorization is in place, that requires a lot of upfront investment. And I really think then we need to have a targeted engagement there. And the reason why it has to be targeted is because we're in this competitive situation for resources. They're by no means unlimited, no big shock there. But honestly, we have to be very clever how we sort of spend the limited resources we have to address this multiplicity of the challenges. But I really want to finish that, you know, having moved from London to Amsterdam just at the beginning of well, is it still this year, I suppose, from a formal point of view, it's great to have such a strong life science base as you do enjoy in the Netherlands itself. And I think one of the colleagues was referring, is it the triple helix model or the quadruple helix model? No matter what you say, I mean, if you go back to that sort of relationship between academia, between industry, between the government, the regulator, and that includes the full extent of that, the clinical trial, the risk benefit, the HTA, the payer type decision makers, and the healthcare professionals in the healthcare systems, and of course then the role of the patient at the center. If you have an ecosystem that's open to innovation and that fosters that, and that allows an evidence-based discussion, and because that's what it's about. I mean, like, you know, this isn't just sort of opinion, personal opinion or judgment. This really is all about generating the evidence on which then you're making the appropriate decisions. I think that's a fantastic contribution. And in that sense, I believe, you know, the Netherlands and the system you've built is a center of excellence in Europe. And in common then with the workload, the work sharing model of European Union, we should endeavor to sort of link some of these centers of excellence and try to deliver this regulatory science agenda over the next 5 years and beyond. Because, you know, as I say, we are in a competitive situation even on a global basis, and delivering on this agenda, I truly believe will you know, at least future-proof our position in Europe as a place to do future development in. I don't know, Sabine, is that what you're expecting? But that's pretty much what I've taken from the afternoon. Forgive me for not going into the other contributions very rich after the coffee break, but I decided I'd call it quits at that stage, if that's okay. Thank you. Over.
Thank you very much, Tony. A very nice reflection of the day. And I think indeed the discussions after the break were very rich and very intense with the 10 minutes. We already expected that, and it turned out to be, but I think they were also very, very helpful. So thank you very much for that. I think we're almost ready to close this meeting. I have noted 3 important things for myself, and that's collaboration, which is of course the obvious, innovation and implementation. I think that was also very important, that we need to give value to everything that we do. Unfortunately, it's been mentioned very often, the patient is in the center. It's all about public health, and it's been illustrated by very helpful, interesting presentations on the edge, I think, of regulation, of science and of research. And one of the things that I will take away is that we need to learn to talk each other language. And I'm very content to see that there are several initiatives ongoing to do that. And I think this is one of them. I would like to thank our speakers. I would like to thank our panelists very, very much. It remains challenging to have it in a virtual meeting, but nevertheless, I think we were able to address some of the questions that were there. I have two very basic announcements. First of all the question to Paul on the at home. Yes, there will be a platform, but it's not yet in the public domain. So that's one thing. And the other thing is some of the questions were, will the presentations be available? And they will be reviewed and they will be discussed with the presenters. And based on that outcome, the presentations will also be made available on the website of the RSNN. I hope I said that correctly. And there also will be a meeting report and hopefully a scientific publication based on the information that we have presented here today. And with that, I think, thank you very much. And I also would like to thank Dwayne very much because he has been behind the scenes invaluable or very valuable. I don't know. I think I said the wrong word, but very valuable. Thank you so much for mediating everything and taking good care of us from the digital point of view. And I hope you enjoyed the afternoon. I myself enjoyed it very, very much. It was extremely interesting and I learned a lot. So thank you to everybody who participated, presented, and were panelists and were participants. Thank you, and hopefully we see each other soon in the near future. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks.
Bye, everybody.